Chapter 0 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. Chapter 0. The author's declaration. And Gil Blas to the reader. There are some people in the world so mischievous as not to read a work without applying the vicious or ridiculous characters it may happen to contain to eminent or popular individuals. I protest publicly against the pretended discovery of any such likenesses. My purpose was to represent human life historically as it exists. God forbid I should hold myself out as a portrait painter. Let not the reader then take to himself public property, for if he does, he may chance to throw an unlucky light on his own character, as Phaedrus expresses it, stulte nudabit animi conscientiam. Certain physicians of Castile, as well as of France, are sometimes a little too fond of trying the bleeding and lowering systems on their patients. Vices, their patrons, and their dupes are of every day's occurrence. To be sure, I have not always adopted Spanish manners with scrupulous exactness, and in the instance of the players at Madrid, those who know their disorderly modes of living may reproach me with softening down their coarser traits, but this I have been induced to do from a sense of delicacy and in conformity with the manners of my own country. Gil Blas to the reader. Reader, hark you, my friend, do not begin the story of my life till I have told you a short tale. Two students traveled together from Penafiel to Salamanca. Finding themselves tired and thirsty, they stopped by the side of a spring on the road. While they were resting there, after having quenched their thirst, by chance they espied on a stone near them, even with the ground, part of an inscription, in some degree effaced by time and by the tread of flocks in the habit of watering at that spring. Having washed the stone, they were able to trace these words in the dialect of Castile: Aqui esta encerrada el alma del licenciado Pedro Garcias. Here lies interred the soul of the licentiate Peter Garcias. Heyday, roars out the younger, a lively, heedless fellow who could not get on with his deciphering for laughter. This is a good joke indeed. Here lies interred the soul, a soul interred. I should like to know the whimsical author of this ludicrous epitaph. With this sneer he got up to go away. His companion, who had more sense, said within himself, underneath this stone lies some mystery. I will stay and see the end of it. Accordingly, he let his comrade depart, and without loss of time began digging round about the stone with his knife till he got it up. Under it he found a purse of leather containing 100 ducats, with a card on which was written these words in Latin: Whoever thou art who hast wit enough to discover the meaning of the inscription, I appoint thee my heir, in the hope thou wilt make a better use of my fortune than I have done. The student, out of his wits at the discovery, replaced the stone in its former position and set out again on the Salamanca road with the soul of the licentiate in his pocket. Now, my good friend and reader, no matter who you are, you must be like one or the other of these two students. If you cast your eye over my adventures without fixing it on the moral concealed under them, you will derive very little benefit from the perusal. But if you read with attention, you will find that mixture of the useful with the agreeable so successfully prescribed by Horace. End of chapter 0. The author's declaration and Gil Blas to the reader. Book 1, Chapter 1 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 1, The Birth and Education of Gil Blas. My father, Blas of Santillane, after having borne arms for a long time in the Spanish service, retired to his native place. There he married a chambermaid who was not exactly in her teens, and I made my debut on this stage 10 months after marriage. They afterwards went to live at Oviedo, where my mother got into service and my father obtained a situation equally adapted to his capacities as a squire. As their wages were their fortune, I might have got my education as I could, had it not been for an uncle of mine in the town, a canon by name Gil Blas. He was my mother's eldest brother and my godfather. Figure to yourself a little fellow 3 feet and a half high, as fat as you can conceive, with a head sunk deep between his shoulders, and you have my uncle to the life. For the rest of his qualities, he was an ecclesiastic, and of course thought of nothing but good living, I mean in the flesh as well as in the spirit, with the means of which good living his stall, no lean one, provided him. He took me home to his own house from my infancy, and ran the risk of my bringing up. I struck him as so brisk a lad that he resolved to cultivate my talents. He bought me a primer, and undertook my tuition as far as reading went, which was not amiss for himself as well as for me, since by teaching me my letters he brushed up his own learning, which had not been pursued in a very scholastic manner, and by dint of application he got at last to read his breviary out of hand, which he had never been able to do before. He would have been very glad to have taught me Latin to save expense, but alas, poor Gil Blas, he had never skimmed the first principles of it in the whole course of his life. I should not wonder if he was the most ignorant member of the chapter, though on a subject involving as many possibilities as there were canons, I presume not to pledge myself for anything like certainty. To be sure, I've heard it suggested that he did not gain his preferment altogether by his learning, but that he owed it exclusively to the gratitude of some good nuns, whose discreet factor he had been, and who had credit enough to procure him the order of priesthood without the troublesome ceremony of an examination. He was obliged, therefore, to place me under the correction of a master, so that I was sent to Dr. Godinez, who had the reputation of being the most accomplished pedant of Oviedo. I profited so well under his instructions that by the end of 5 or 6 years I could read a Greek author or two, and had no very inadequate conception of the Latin poets. Besides my classical studies, I applied to logic, which enabled me to become an expert arguer. I now fell in love with discussions of all kinds to such an excess that I stopped His Majesty's subjects on the high road, acquaintance or strangers, no matter, and proposed some knotty point of controversy. Sometimes I fell in with a clan of Irish, and an altercation never comes amiss to them. That was your time if you are fond of a battle. Such gestures, such grimaces, such contortions, our eyes sparkling and our mouths foaming. Those who did not take us for what we affected to be, philosophers, must have set us down for madmen. But let that be as it will, I gained the reputation of no small learning in the town. My uncle was delighted, because he prudently considered that I should so much the sooner cease to be chargeable to him. "Come here, Gil Blas," quoth he one day, "you are got to be a fine fellow. You are past 17, and a clever lad. You must bestir yourself and get forward in the world. I think of sending you to the University of Salamanca. With your wit you will easily get a good post. I will give you a few ducats for your journey, and my mule, which will fetch 10 or 12 pistoles at Salamanca, and with such a sum, at setting out, you will be enabled to hold up your head till you get a situation." He could not have proposed to me anything more agreeable, for I was dying to see a little of life. At the same time, I was not such a fool as to betray my satisfaction, and when it came to the hour of parting, by the sensibility I discovered at taking leave of my dear uncle, to whom I was so much obliged, and by calling in the stage effect of grief, I so softened the good soul that he put his hand deeper into his pocket than he would have done could he have pried into all that was passing in the interior of my hypocritical little heart. Before my departure, I took at last leave of my papa and mamma, who loaded me with an ample inheritance of good advice. They enjoined me to pray to God for my uncle, to go honestly through the world, not to engage in any ill, and above all, not to lay my hands on other people's property. After they had lectured me for a good while, they made me a present of their blessing, which was all my patrimony and all my expectation. As soon as I had received it, I mounted my mule and saw the outside of the town. End of Book 1, Chapter 1. Book 1, Chapter 2 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 2. Gil Blas' alarm on his road to Peñaflor, his adventures on his arrival in that town, and the character of the men with whom he supped. Here I am, then, on the other side of Oviedo, on the road to Peñaflor, with the world before me, as yet my own master, as well as master of a bad mule and 40 good ducats, without reckoning on a little supplementary cash purloined from my much-honored uncle. The first thing I did was to let my mule go as the beast liked, that is to say, very lazily. I dropped the rein, and taking out my ducats, began to count them backwards and forwards in my hat. I was out of my wits for joy, never having seen such a sum of money before, and could not help looking at it and sifting it through my fingers. I had counted it over about the 20th time, when all at once my mule, with head raised and ears pricked up, stood stock still in the middle of the high road. I thought, to be sure, something was the matter, looked about for a cause, and perceiving a hat upon the ground, with a rosary of large beads, at the same time heard a lugubrious voice pronounce these words: "Pray, honored master, have pity on a poor maimed soldier. Please to throw a few small pieces into this hat. You shall be rewarded for it in the other world." I looked immediately on the side whence the voice proceeded, and saw, just by a thicket 20 or 30 paces from me, a sort of a soldier, who had mounted the barrel of a confounded long carbine on 2 cross sticks, and seemed to be taking aim at me. At a sight which made me tremble for the patrimony of the church committed to my care, I stopped short, made sure of my ducats, and taking out a little small change, as I rode by the hat, placed to receive the charity of those quiet subjects who had not the courage to refuse it, dropped in my contribution in detail to convince the soldier how nobly I dealt by him. He was satisfied with my liberality, and gave me a blessing for every kick I gave my mule in my impatience to get out of his way. But the infernal beast, without partaking in the slightest degree of my impatience, went at the old steady pace. A long custom of jogging on fair and softly under my uncle's weight had obliterated every idea of that motion called a gallop. The prospect of my journey was not much improved by this adventure. As a specimen, I considered within myself that I had yet some distance to Salamanca, and might not improbably meet with something worse. My uncle seemed to have been very imprudent not to have consigned me to the care of a muleteer. That, to be sure, was what he ought to have done, but his notion was that by giving me his mule, my journey would be cheaper, and that entered more into his calculation than the dangers in which I might be involved on the road. To retrieve his error, therefore, I resolved, if I had the good luck to arrive safe at Peñaflor, to offer my mule for sale, and take the opportunity of a muleteer going to Astorga, whence I might get to Salamanca by a similar conveyance. Though I had never been out of Oviedo, I was acquainted with the names of the towns through which I was to pass, a species of information I took care to procure before my setting out. I got safe and sound to Peñaflor, and stopped at the door of a very decent-looking inn. My foot was scarcely out of the stirrup before the landlord was at my side, overwhelming me with public-house civility. He untied my cloak-bag with his own hands, swung it across his shoulders, and ushered my honor into a room, while one of his men led my mule to the stable. This landlord, the most busy prattler of the Asturias, ready to bother you impertinently about his own concerns, and at the same time with a sufficient portion of curiosity to worm himself into the knowledge of yours, was not long in telling me that his name was Andrew Corsiello, that he had seen some service as a sergeant in the army, which he had quitted 15 months ago, and married a girl of Castropol, who, though a little tawny or so, knew how to make both ends meet as well as the best of them. He told me 1,000 things besides which he might just as well have kept private, thinking himself entitled, after this voluntary confidence, to an equal share of mine. He asked me in a breath, and without further preface, whence I came, whither I was going, and who I was. To all this I felt myself bound to answer, article by article, because, though rather abrupt in asking them, he accompanied each question with so apologetic a bow, beseeching me with so submissive a grimace not to be offended at his curiosity, that I was drawn in to gratify it whether I would or no. Thus by degrees did we get into a long conversation, in the course of which I took occasion to hint that I had some reasons for wishing to get rid of my mule, and travel under convoy of a muleteer. He seemed on the whole to approve of my plan, though he could not prevail with himself to tell me so briefly, for he introduced his remarks by descanting on all the possible and probable mischances to which travelers are liable on the road, not omitting an awkward story now and then. I thought the fellow would never have done, but the conclusion of the argument was that if I wanted to sell my mule, he knew an honest jockey who would take it off my hands. I begged that he would do me the favor to fetch him, which was no sooner said than done. On his return he introduced the purchaser, with a high encomium on his integrity. We all three went into the yard, and the mule was brought out to show paces before the jockey, who set himself to examine the beast from head to foot. His report was bad enough. To be sure, it would not have been easy to make a good one, but if it had been the Pope's mule, and this fellow was to cheapen the bargain, it would have been just the same. Nay, to speak with all due reverence, if he had been asked to give an opinion of the Pope's great toe, from that disparaging habit of his, he would have pronounced it no better than the toe of any ordinary man. He laid it down, therefore, as a principle, that the mule had all the defects a mule could have, appealing to the landlord for a confirmation of his judgment, who doubtless had reasons of his own for not controverting his friend's assertion. "Well," says the jockey, with an air of indifference, "what price have you the conscience to ask for this devil of an animal?" After such a panegyric, and Master Corsiello's certificate, whom I was fool enough to take for a fair-dealing man and a good judge of horseflesh, they might have had the mule for nothing. I therefore told the dealer that I threw myself on his mercy. He must fix his own sum, and I should expect no more. On this he began to affect the gentleman, and answered that I had found out his weak side when I left it to his honor. He was right enough in that. His honor was his weak side, for instead of bidding up to my uncle's estimate of 10 or 12 pistoles, the rascal had the impudence to offer 3 ducats, which I accepted with as light a heart as if I had got the best of the bargain. Having disencumbered myself of my mule in so tradesmanlike a manner, I went with my landlord to a carrier who was to set out early the next morning for Astorga, and engaged to call me up in time. When we had settled the hire of the mule, as well as the expenses on the road, I turned back towards the inn with Corsiello, who, as we went along, got into the private history of this muleteer. When I had been pestered with all the tittle-tattle of the town about this fellow, the changes were just beginning to ring on some new subject, but by good luck a pretty-looking sort of a man very civilly interrupted my loquacious friend. I left them together, and sauntered on without the slightest suspicion of being at all concerned in their discourse. I ordered supper as soon as I got to the inn. It was a fish day, but I thought eggs were better suited to my finances. While they were getting ready, I joined in conversation with the landlady, whom I had not seen before. She seemed a pretty piece of goods enough, and such a stirring body, that I should have concluded, if her husband had not told me so, her tavern must have plenty of custom. The moment the omelette was served up, I sat down to table by myself, and had scarcely got the relish of it when my landlord walked in, followed by the man who had stopped him in the street. This pleasant gentleman wore a long rapier, and might perhaps be about 30 years of age. He came up to me in the most friendly manner possible. "Mr. Professor," says he, "I have just now heard that you are the renowned Gil Blas of Santillane, that ornament of Oviedo and luminary of philosophy. And do my eyes behold that very greatest of all scholars and wits, whose reputation has run hither so fast before him. Little do you think," continues he, directing his discourse to the landlord and landlady, "little do you imagine, I say, what good luck has befallen you. Why, you have got hold of a treasure. In this young gentleman you behold the eighth wonder of the world." Then running up and throwing his arms about my neck, "Excuse me," added he, "but worlds would not bribe me to suppress the rapturous emotions your honored presence has excited." I could not answer him so glibly as I wished, not so much for want of words as of breath, for he hugged me so tight that I began to be alarmed for my windpipe. As soon, however, as I had got my head out of durance, I replied, "Signor Cavalier, I had not the least conception that my name was known at Peñaflor." "Known," resumed he in the same pompous style, "we keep a register of all great persons within a circuit of 20 leagues round us. You have the character of a prodigy here, and I have not a shadow of doubt but one day or other Spain will be as proud of numbering you among her rare productions as Greece of having given birth to her 7 wise men." This fine speech was followed as before, and I really began to think that with all my classical honors I should at last be doomed to share the fate of Antaeus. If I had been master of ever so little experience, I shouldn't have been the dupe of his rhodomontade. I must have discovered him by his outrageous compliments to be one of those parasites who swarm in every town and get into a stranger's company on his arrival to appease the wolf in their stomachs at his expense. But my youth and vanity tempted me to draw a quite opposite conclusion. My admirer was very clever in my eyes, and I asked him to supper on the strength of it. "Oh, most willingly," cried he, "with all my heart and soul. My fortunate star predominates now that I have the honor of being in company with the illustrious Gil Blas of Santillane, and I shall certainly make the most of my good fortune as long as it lasts. My appetite is rather delicate, but I will just sit down with you by way of being sociable, and if I can swallow a bit, only just not to look sulky, for we philosophers are careless of the body." These words were no sooner out of his mouth than my panegyrist took his seat opposite to me. A cover was laid for him in due form and order. First he fell on the omelette with as much perseverance as if he had not tasted food for 3 whole days. By the complacency with which he eyed it, I was morally certain the poor pancake was at death's door. I therefore ordered its heir apparent to succeed, and the business was dispatched with such speed that the second made its appearance on the table just as I beg pardon, just as he had taken the last lick of its predecessor. He pressed forward the main business, however, with a diligence and activity proportioned to the importance of the object he had in view, so that he contrived to load me with panegyric on panegyric without losing a single stroke in the progress of mastication. Now all this gave me no slender conceit of my pretty little self. When a man eats, he must drink. The first toast, of course, was my health. The second, in common civility, was my father and mother, whose happiness in having such an angel of a son he could not sufficiently envy or admire. All this while he kept filling my glass and challenging me to keep pace with him. It was impossible to be backward in doing justice to such excellent toasts and sentiments. The compliments with which they were seasoned did not come amiss, so that I got into such a convivial mood at observing our second omelette to disappear not insensibly, as just to ask the landlord if he could not find us a little bit of fish. Master Consuelo, who to all appearance played booty with the parasite, told me he had an excellent trout, but those who eat him must pay for him. "I am afraid he is meat for your masters." "Meat for our masters," exclaims my very humble servant in an angry tone of voice. "That is more than you know, my friend. Are you yet to learn that the best of your larder is not too good for the renowned Gil Blas of Santillane? Go where he will, he is fit to table with princes. I was very glad that he took up the landlord's last expression, because if he had not, I should. I felt myself a little hurt at it, and said to Corsiello, with some degree of hauteur, "Produce this trout of yours, and I will take the consequences." The landlord, who had got just what he wanted, set himself to work and served it up in high order. At the first glance of this third course, I saw such pleasure sparkling in the parasite's eyes as proved him to be of a very complying temper, just as ready to do a kindness by the fish as by those said eggs of which he had given so good an account. But at last he was obliged to lay down his arms for fear of accidents, as his magazine was crammed to the very throat. Having eaten and drank his fill, he bethought him of putting a finishing hand to the farce. "Master Gil Blas," said he, as he rose from the table, "I am too well pleased with my princely entertainment to leave you without a word of advice, of which you seem to stand in much need. From this time forward be on your guard against extravagant praise. Do not trust men till you know them. You may meet with many another man who, like me, may amuse himself at your expense, and perhaps carry the joke a little further, but do not you be taken in a second time to believe yourself, on the word of such fellows, the eighth wonder of the world." With this sting in the tail of his farewell speech, he very coolly took his leave. I was as much alive to so ridiculous a circumstance as I have ever been in after life to the most severe mortifications. I did not know how to reconcile myself to the idea of having been so egregiously taken in, or in fact to lowering of my pride. So, quoth I, this rascal has been putting his tricks upon travellers, has he? Then he only wanted to pump my landlord, or more likely they were both in a story. Ah, my poor Gil Blas, thou hadst better hide thy silly head, to have suffered such knaves as these to turn thee into ridicule. A pretty story they will make of this. It is sure to travel back to Oviedo, and will give our friends a hopeful prospect of thy success in life. The family will be quite delighted to think what a blessed harvest all their pious advice has produced. There was no occasion to preach up morals to thee, for verily thou hast more of the dupe than the sharper in thy composition. Ready to tear my eyes out or bite my fingers off from spite and vexation, I locked myself up in my chamber and went to bed, but not to sleep, of which I had not got a wink when the muleteer came to tell me that he only waited for me to set out on his journey. I got up as expeditiously as I could, and while I was dressing, Corsiello put in his appearance with a little bill in his hand, a slight memorandum of the trout. But paying through the nose was not the worst of it, for I had the vexation to perceive that while I was counting over the cost, this hang-dog was chuckling at the recollection of the night before. Having been fleeced most shamefully for a supper, which stuck in my stomach, though I had scarcely come in for a morsel of it, I joined the muleteer with my baggage, giving to as many devils as there are saints in the calendar, the parasite, the landlord, and the inn. End of Book 1, Chapter 2. Book 1, Chapter 3 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 3. The muleteer's temptation on the road, its consequences, and the situation of Gil Blas between Scylla and Charybdis. I was not the only passenger. There were two young gentlemen of Peñaflor, a little chorister of Mandanedo, who was travelling about the country, and a young tradesman of Astorga, returning home from Verco with his new married wife. We soon got acquainted and exchanged the usual confidence of travellers, telling one another whence we came and whither we were going. The bride was young enough, but so dark-complexioned, with so little of what a man likes to look at in a woman, that I did not think her worth the trouble. But she had youth and a good crummy person on her side, and the muleteer, being rather less nice in his taste, was resolved to try if he could not get into her good graces. This pretty project occupied his ingenuity during the whole day, but he deferred the execution till we should get to Cacabelos, the last place where we were to stop on the road. We alighted at an inn in the outskirts of the town, a quiet, convenient place with a landlord who never troubled himself about other people's concerns. We were ushered into a private room and got our supper snugly, but just as the cloth was taken away, in comes our carrier in a furious passion. Death and the devil! I have been robbed. Here had I 100 pistoles in my purse, but I will have them back again. I am going for a magistrate, and those gentry will not take a joke upon such serious subjects. You will all be put to the rack unless you confess and give back the money. The fellow played his part very naturally and burst out of the room, leaving us in a terrible fright. We had none of us the least suspicion of the trick, and being all strangers, were afraid of one another. I looked askance at the little chorister, and he perhaps had no better opinion of me. Besides, we were all a pack of greenhorns, and were quite unacquainted with the routine of business on these occasions. We were fools enough to believe that the torture would be the very first stage of our examination. With this dread upon our spirits, we all made for the door. Some effected their escape into the street, others into the garden, but the whole party preferred the discretion of running away to the valor of standing their ground. The young tradesman of Astorga had as great an objection to bone-twisting as the rest of us. So he did as Aeneas and many another good husband has done before him, ran away and left his wife behind. At that critical moment, the muleteer, as I was told afterwards, who had not half so much sense of decency as his own mules, delighted at the success of his stratagem, began moving his motives to the citizen's wife. But this Lucrece of the Asturias, borrowing the chastity of a saint from the ugliness of the devil who tempted her, defended her sweet person tooth and nail, and showed she was in earnest about it by the noise she made. The patrol, who happened to be passing by the inn at the time and knew that the neighborhood required a little looking after, took the liberty of just asking the cause of the disturbance. The landlord, who was trying if he could not sing in the kitchen louder than she could scream in the parlor, and swore he heard no music but his own, was at last obliged to introduce the myrmidons of the police to the distressed lady, just in time to rescue her from the necessity of a surrender at discretion. The head officer, a coarse fellow without an atom of feeling for the tender passion, no sooner saw the game that was playing than he gave the amorous muleteer 5 or 6 blows with the butt end of his halberd, representing to him the indecency of his conduct in terms quite as offensive to modesty as the naughty propensity which had called forth his virtuous indignation. Neither did he stop here, but laid hold of the culprit and carried plaintiff and defendant before the magistrate. The former, with her charms all heightened by the discomposure of her dress, went eagerly to try their effect in obtaining justice for the outrage they had sustained. His worship heard at least one party, and after solemn deliberation pronounced the offense to be of a most heinous nature. He ordered him to be stripped and to receive a competent number of lashes in his presence. The conclusion of the sentence was that if the Endymion of our Asturian Diana was not forthcoming the next day, a couple of guards should escort the disconsolate goddess to the town of Astorga at the expense of this mule-driving Actaeon. For my part, being probably more terrified than the rest of the party, I got into the fields, scampering over hedge and ditch, through enclosures and across commons, till I found myself hard by a forest. I was just going for concealment to ensconce myself in the very heart of the thicket, when 2 men on horseback rode across me, crying, "Who goes there?" As my alarm prevented me from giving them an immediate answer, they came to close quarters, and holding each of them a pistol to my throat, required me to give an account of myself, who I was, whence I came, what business I had in that forest, and above all not to tell a lie about it. Their rough interrogatives were, according to my notion, little better than the rack with which our friend the muleteer had offered to treat us. I represented myself, however, as a young man on my way from Oviedo to Salamanca, told the story of our late fright, and faithfully attributed my running away in such a hurry to the dread of a worse exercise under the torture. They burst into an immoderate fit of laughter at my simplicity, and one of them said, "Take heart, my little friend. Come along with us, and do not be afraid. We will put you in a place where the devil shall not find you." At these words he took me up behind him, and we darted into the forest. I did not know what to think of this odd meeting, yet on the whole I could not well be worse off than before. If these gentry, thought I to myself, had been thieves, they would have robbed and perhaps murdered me. Depend on it, they are a couple of good, honest country gentlemen in this neighborhood, who, seeing me frightened, have taken compassion on me, and mean to carry me home with them and make me comfortable. But these visions did not last long. After turning and winding backward and forward in deep silence, we found ourselves at the foot of a hill, where we dismounted. "This is our abode," said one of these sequestered gentlemen. I looked about in all directions, but the deuce a bit of either house or cottage, not a vestige of human habitation. The two men in the meantime raised a great wooden trap, covered with earth and briars, to conceal the entrance of a long shelving passage underground, to which, from habits, the poor beasts took very kindly of their own accord. Their masters kept tight hold of me, and let the trap down after them. Thus was the worthy nephew of my Uncle Perez caught, just for all the world as you would catch a rat. End of Book 1, Chapter 3. Book 1, Chapter 4 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 4. Description of the subterraneous dwelling and its contents. I now knew into what company I had fallen, and I leave it to any one to judge whether the discovery must not have rid me of my former fear. A dread more mighty and more just now seized my faculties, money and life all given up for lost. With the air of a victim on his passage to the altar did I walk, more dead than alive, between my two conductors, who, finding that I trembled, frightened me so much the more by telling me not to be afraid. When we had gone 200 paces, winding down a declivity all the way, we got into a stable lighted by two large iron lamps suspended from the vault above. There was a good store of straw and several casks of hay and corn, with room enough for 20 horses. But at that time there were only the two which came with us. An old negro, who seemed for his years in pretty good case, was tying them to the rack where they were to feed. We went out of the stable. By the melancholy light of some other lamps, which only served to dress up horror in its native colors, we arrived at a kitchen, where an old harridan was broiling some steaks on the coals and getting supper ready. The kitchen furniture was better than might be expected, and the pantry provided in a very plentiful manner. The lady of the larder's picture is worth drawing. Considerably on the wrong side of 60, in her youth her hair had been of a fiery red, though she would have called it auburn. Time had indeed given it the fairer tint of gray, but a lock of more youthful hue, interspersed at intervals, produced all the variegated effect of the admired autumnal shades. To say nothing of an olive complexion, she had an enormous chin turning up, an immense nose turning down, with a mouth in the middle modestly retiring inwards to make room for its encroaching neighbors. Red eyes are no beauty in any animal but a ferret. Hers were purple. "Here, Dame Leonarda," said one of the horsemen as he presented me to this angelic imp of darkness, "we have brought you a young lad." Then looking round and observing me to be miserably pale, "Pluck up your spirits, my friend, you shall come to no harm. We want a scullion and have met with you. You are a lucky dog. We had a boy who died about a fortnight ago. You shall succeed to the preferment. He was rather too delicate for his place. You seem a good stout fellow, and may live a week or two longer. We find you in bed and board, coal and candle, but as for daylight, you will never see that again. Your leisure hours will pass off very agreeably with Leonarda, who is really a very good creature and tolerably tender-hearted. You will have all your little comforts about you. I flatter myself you have not got among beggars." At this moment the thief seized a flambeau, and, as I feared, with zeal to destroy, for he ordered me to follow him. He took me into a cellar where I saw a great number of bottles and earthen pots full of excellent wine. He then made me cross several rooms. In some were pieces of cloth piled up, in others stuffs and silks. As we passed through, I could not help casting a sheep's eye at the gold and silver plate peeping out of the different cupboards. After that I followed him into a great hall illuminated by 3 copper lustres, and serving as a gallery between the other rooms. Here he put fresh questions to me, asking my name, why I left Oviedo, and when I had satisfied his curiosity, "Well, Gil Blas," said he, "since your only motive for quitting your native place was to get into something snug and eligible, to be sure you must have been born to good luck, or you would not have fallen into our hands. I tell you once for all, you will live here on the fat of the land, and may souse over head and ears in ready money. Besides, you are in a place of perfect safety. The officers of the Holy Brotherhood might pass through the forest 100 times without discovering our subterraneous abode. The entrance is only known to myself and my comrades. You may perhaps ask how it came to be contrived without being perceived by the inhabitants in the neighborhood, but you are to understand, my friend, that it was made long ago, and is no work of ours. After the Moors had made themselves masters of Granada, of Aragon, and nearly the whole of Spain, the Christians, rather than submit to the tyranny of infidels, betook themselves to flight, and lay concealed in this country, in Biscay, and in the Asturias, whither the brave Don Pelagio had withdrawn himself. They lived in a state of exile on the mountains or in the woods, dispersed in little knots. Some took up their residences in natural caves, others in artificial dwellings underground, like this we are in. In process of time, when by the blessing of Providence they had driven their enemies out of Spain, they returned to the towns. From that time forth their retreats have served as a rendezvous for the gentlemen of our profession. It is true that several of them have been discovered and destroyed by the Holy Brotherhood, but there are some yet remaining, and by great good luck I have tenanted this without paying any rent for it almost these 15 years. Captain Rolando, at your service. I am the leader of the band, and the man you saw with me is one of my troopers. End of Book 1, Chapter 4. Book 1, Chapter 5 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 5, The Arrival of the Banditti in the Subterraneous Retreat, with an account of their pleasant conversation. Just as Captain Rolando had finished his speech, 6 new faces made their appearance in the hall, the lieutenant and 5 privates returning home with their booty. They were hauling in 2 great baskets full of sugar, cinnamon, pepper, figs, almonds, and raisins. The lieutenant gave an account of their proceedings to the captain and told him they had taken these articles, as well as the sumpter mule, from a grocer of Benevento. An official report having thus been made to the Prime Minister, the grocer's contribution was carried to account, and the next step was to regale after their labors. A large table was set out in the hall. They sent me back to the kitchen, where Dame Leonarda told me what I had to do. I made the best of a bad bargain, finding the luck ran against me, and swallowing my grievances, set myself to wait on my noble masters. I cleaned my plates, set out my sideboard, and brought up my wine. As soon as I announced dinner to be on table, consisting of 2 good black peppery ragouts for the first course, this high and mighty company took their seats. They fell to most voraciously. My place was to wait, and I handed about the glasses with so butler-like an air as to be not a little complimented on my dexterity. The chief entertained them with a short sketch of my story and praised my parts. But I had recovered from my mania by this time, and could listen to my own panegyric with the humility of an anchorite or the contempt of a philosopher. They all seemed to take a liking to me, and to think I had dropped from the clouds on purpose to be their cup-bearer. My predecessor was a fool to me. Since his death, the illustrious Leonarda had the honor of presenting nectar to these gods of the lower regions, but she was now degraded, and I had the felicity of being installed in her office. Thus old Hebe, being a little the worse for wear, young Ganymede tripped up her heels. A substantial joint of meat after the ragouts at length blunted the edge of their appetites. Eating and drinking went together, so that they soon got into a merry pin and made a roaring noise. Well done, my lads, all talkers and no listeners. One begins a long story, another cuts a joke. Here a fellow bawls, there a fellow sings, and they all seem to be at cross purposes. At last Rolando, tired of a concert in which he could hardly hear the sound of his own voice, let them know that he was maestro di capella, and brought them into better tune. Gentlemen, said he, I have a question to put. Instead of stunning one another with this infernal din, had we not better enjoy a little rational conversation? A thought has just come into my head. Since the happy day that united us, we have never had the curiosity to inquire into each other's pedigrees, or by what chain of circumstances we were each of us led to embrace our present way of life. There would be no harm in knowing who and who are together. Let us exchange confidence. We may find some amusement in it. The lieutenant and the rest, like true heroes of romance, accepted the challenge with the utmost courtesy, and the captain told the first story to the following effect. Gentlemen, you are to know that I am the only son of a rich citizen in Madrid. The day of my birth was celebrated in the family by rejoicings without end. My father, no chicken, thought it a considerable feat to have got an heir, and my mother was kind enough to suckle me herself. My maternal grandfather was still living, a good old man who did not trouble himself about other people's concerns, but said his prayers and fought his campaigns over and over again, for he had been in the army. Of course, I was idolized by these 3 persons, never out of their arms. My early years were passed in the most childish amusements, for fear of hurting my health by application. It will not do, said my father, to hammer much learning into children till time has ripened their understanding. While he waited for this ripening, the season went by. I could neither read nor write, but I made up for that in other ways. My father taught me 1,000 different games. I became perfectly acquainted with cards, was no stranger to dice, and my grandfather set me the example of drawing the longbow, while he entertained me with his military exploits. He sung the same songs repeatedly one after another every day, so that when, after saying 10 or 12 lines after him for 3 months together, I got to boggle through them without missing, the whole family were in raptures at my memory. Neither was my wit thought to be at all less extraordinary, for I was suffered to talk at random and took care to put in my oar in the most impertinent manner possible. "Oh, the pretty little dear!" exclaimed my father, as if he had been fascinated. My mother made it up with kisses, and my grandfather's old eyes overflowed. I played all sorts of dirty and indecent tricks before them with impunity. Everything was excusable in so fine a boy. An angel could not do wrong. Going on in this manner, I was already in my 12th year without ever having a master. It was high time. But then he was to teach me by fair means. He might threaten, but must not flog me. This arrangement did me but little good, for sometimes I laughed when my tutor scolded. At others, I ran with tears in my eyes to my mother or my grandfather and complained that he had used me ill. The poor devil got nothing by denying it. My word was always taken before his, and he came off with the character of a cruel rascal. One day I scratched myself with my own nails and set up a howl as if I had been flogged. My mother ran and turned the master out of doors, though he vowed and protested he had never lifted a finger against me. Thus did I get rid of all my tutors, till at last I met with one to my mind. He was a bachelor of Alcala. This was the master for a young man of fashion. Women, wine, and gaming were his principal amusements. It was impossible to be in better hands. He hit the right nail on the head, for he let me do what I pleased, and thus got into the good graces of the family, who abandoned me to his conduct. They had no reason to repent. He perfected me betimes in the knowledge of the world. By dint of taking me about to all his haunts, he gave such a finish to my education that, barring literature and science, I became an universal scholar. As soon as he saw that I could go alone in the high road to ruin, he went to qualify others for the same journey. During my childhood I had lived at home just as I liked, and did not sufficiently consider that now I was beginning to be responsible for my own actions. My father and mother were a standing jest, yet they were themselves thrown into convulsions at my sallies, and the more ridiculous they were made by them, the more waggish they thought me. In the meantime I got into all manner of scrapes with some young fellows of my own kidney, and as our relations kept us rather too short of cash for the exigencies of so loose a life, we each of us made free with whatever we could lay our hands on in our own families. Finding this would not raise the supplies, we began to pick pockets in the streets at night. As ill luck would have it, our exploits came to the knowledge of the police. A warrant was out against us, but some good-natured friend, thinking it a pity we should be nipped in the bud, gave us a caution. We took to our heels, and rose in our vocation to the rank of highwaymen. From that time forth, gentlemen, with a blessing on my endeavors, I have gone on till I am almost the father of the profession, in spite of the dangers to which it is exposed. Here the captain ended, and it came to the turn of the lieutenant. Gentlemen, extremes are said to meet, and so it will appear from a comparison of our commander's education and mine. My father was a butcher at Toledo. He passed with reason for the greatest brute in the town, and my mother's sweet disposition was not mended by the example. In my childhood they whipped me in emulation of one another. I came in for 1,000 lashes of a day. The slightest fault was followed up by the severest punishment. In vain did I beg for mercy with tears in my eyes, and protest that I was sorry for what I had done. They never excused me, and 9 times out of 10 flogged me for nothing. When I was under my father's lash, my mother, not thinking his arm stout enough, lent her assistance instead of begging me off. The favors I received at their hands gave me such a disgust that I quitted their house before I had completed my 14th year, took the Aragon road, and begged my way to Saragossa. There I associated with vagrants who led a merry life enough. They taught me to counterfeit blindness and lameness, to dress up an artificial wound in each of my legs, and to adopt many other methods of imposing on the credulity of the charitable and humane. In the morning, like actors at rehearsal, we cast our characters and settled the business of the comedy. We had each our exits and our entrances, till in the evening the curtain dropped and we regaled at the expense of the dupes we had deluded in the day. Wearied, however, with the company of these wretches, and wishing to live in more worshipful society, I entered into partnership with a gang of sharpers. These fellows taught me some good tricks, but Saragossa soon became too hot to hold us, after we had fallen out with a limb of the law, who had hitherto taken us under his protection. We each of us provided for ourselves and left the devil to take the hindmost. For my part, I enlisted in a brave and veteran regiment, which had seen abundance of service on the King's highway, and I found myself so comfortable in their quarters that I had no desire to change my berth. So that you see, gentlemen, I was very much obliged to my relations for their bad behavior, for if they had treated me a little more kindly, I might have been a blackguard butcher at this moment, instead of having the honor to be your lieutenant. Gentlemen, interrupted a hopeful young freebooter who sat between the captain and the lieutenant, the stories we have just heard are neither so complicated nor so curious as mine. I peeped into existence by means of a countrywoman in the neighborhood of Seville. 3 weeks after she had set me down in this system, a nurse child was offered her. You are to understand she was yet in her prime, comely in her person, and had a good breast of milk. The young suckling had noble blood in him, and was an only son. My mother accepted the proposal with all her heart, and went to fetch the child. It was entrusted to her care. She had no sooner brought it home than, fancying a resemblance, she conceived the idea of substituting me for the brat of high birth, in the hope of drawing a handsome commission at some future time for this motherly office in behalf of her infant. My father, whose morals were on a level with those of clodhoppers in general, lent himself very willingly to the cheat, so that with only a change of clouts the son of Don Rodrigo de Herrera was packed off in my name to another nurse, and my mother suckled her own and her master's child at once in my little person. They may say what they will of instinct and the force of blood, the little gentleman's parents were very easily taken in. They had not the slightest suspicion of the trick, and were eternally dandling me till I was 7 years old. As it was their intention to make me a finished gentleman, they gave me masters of all kinds. But I had very little taste for their lessons, and above all I detested the sciences. I had at any time rather play with the servants or the stable boys, and was a complete kitchen genius. But tossing up for heads or tails was not my ruling passion. Before 17 I had an itch for getting drunk. I played the devil among the chambermaids, but my prime favorite was a kitchen girl who had infinite merit in my eyes. She was a great bloated horse godmother whose good case and easy morals suited me exactly. I boarded her with so little circumspection that Don Rodrigo took notice of it. He took me to task pretty sharply, twitted me with my low taste, and for fear the presence of my charmer should counteract his sage counsels, showed the goddess of my devotions the outside of the door. This proceeding was rather offensive, and I determined to be even with him. I stole his wife's jewels, and ravishing my Helen from a laundress of her acquaintance, went off with her in open day, that the transaction might lose nothing in point of notoriety. But this was not all. I carried her among her relations, where I married her according to the rites of the church, as much from the personal motive of mortifying Herrera as from the patriotic enthusiasm of encouraging our young nobility to mend the breed. 3 months after marriage, I heard that Don Rodrigo had gone the way of all flesh. The intelligence was not lost upon me. I was at Seville in a twinkling to administer in due form and order to his effects, but the tables were turned. My mother had paid the debt of nature, and in her last agonies had been so much off her guard as to confess the whole affair to the curate of the village and other competent witnesses. Don Rodrigo's son had already taken my place, or rather his own, and his popularity was increased by the deficiency of mine, so that, as the trumps were all out in that hand, I had no particular wish for the present. My wife was likely to make me. I joined issue with some desperate blades with whom I began my trading ventures. The young cut-purse having finished his story, another told us that he was the son of a merchant at Burgos, that in his youth, prompted more by piety than wit, he had taken the religious habit and professed in a very strict order, and that a few years afterwards he had apostatized. In short, the 8 robbers told their tale one after another, and when I had heard them all, I did not wonder that the destinies had brought them together. The conversation now took a different turn. They brought several schemes upon the carpet for the next campaign, and after having laid down their plan of operations, rose from table and went to bed. They lighted their night candles and withdrew to their apartments. I attended Captain Rolando to his, while I was fiddling about him as he undressed. "Well, Gil Blas," said he, "you see how we live. We are always merry. Hatred and envy have no footing here. We have not the least difference, but hang together just like monks. You are sure, my good lad, to lead a pleasant life here, for I do not think you are fool enough to make any bones about consorting with gentlemen of the road. In what does ours differ from many a more reputable trade? Depend on it, my friend, all men love 2 hands in their neighbor's purse, though only one in their own. Men's principles are all alike. The only difference lies in the mode of carrying them into effect. Conquerors, for instance, make free with the territories of their neighbors. People of fashion borrow and do not pay. Bankers, treasurers, brokers, clerks, and traders of all kinds, wholesale and retail, give ample liberty to their wants to overdraw on their consciences. I shall not mention the hangers-on of the law. We all know how it goes with them. At the same time, it must be allowed that they have more humanity than we have, for as it is often our vocation to take away the life of the innocent for plunder, it is sometimes theirs for fee and reward to save the guilty. End of Book 1, Chapter 5. Book 1, Chapter 6 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 6, The Attempt of Gil Blas to Escape and Its Success. After the captain of the banditti had thus apologized for adopting such a line of life, he went to bed. For my part, I returned to the hall, where I cleared the table and set everything to rights. Then I went to the kitchen, where Domingo, the old negro, and Dame Leonarda had been expecting me at supper. Though entirely without appetite, I had the good manners to sit down with them. Not a morsel could I eat, and as I scarcely felt more miserable than I looked, this pair, so justly formed to meet by nature, undertook to give me a little comfort. "Why do you take on so, my good lad?" said the old dowager. "You ought rather to bless your stars for your good luck. You are young and seem a little soft. You would have a fine kettle of fish of it in the busy world. You might have fallen into bad hands, and then your morals would have been corrupted, whereas here your innocence is insured to its full value." "Dame Leonardo is in the right," put in the old negro gravely. "The world is but a troublesome place. Be thankful, my friend, for being so early relieved from the dangers, the difficulties, and the afflictions of this miserable life." I bore this prosing very quietly, because I should have got no good by putting myself in a passion about it. At length Domingo, after playing a good knife and fork and getting gloriously muddled, took himself off to the stable. Leonarda, by the glimmering of a lamp, showed me the way to a vault which served as a last home to those of the corps who died a natural death. Here I stumbled upon something more like a grave than a bed. "This is your room," said she. "Your predecessor lay here as long as he was among us, and here he lies to this day. He suffered himself to be hurried out of life in his prime. Do not you be so foolish as to follow his example." With this kind advice, she left me with the lamp for my companion and returned to the kitchen. I threw myself on the little bed, not so much for rest as meditation. "Oh, heaven!" exclaimed I. Was there ever a fate so dreadful as mine? It is determined, then, I am to take my leave of daylight. Beside this, as if it were not enough to be buried alive at 18, my misery is to be aggravated by being in the service of a banditti, by passing the day with highwaymen, and the night in a charnel house. These reflections, which seemed to me very dismal, and were indeed no better than they seemed, set me crying most bitterly. I could not conceive what cursed maggot my uncle had got in his head to send me to Salamanca, repented running away from Cacabelos, and would have compounded for the torture. But considering how vain it was to shut the door when the steed was stolen, I determined, instead of lamenting the past, to hit upon some expedient for making my escape. What, thought I, is it impossible to get off? The cutthroats are asleep. Cookie and the black will be snoring ere long. Why cannot I, by the help of this lamp, find the passage by which I descended into these infernal regions? I am afraid indeed my strength is not equal to lifting the trap at the entrance. However, let us see. Faint heart never won fair lady. Despair will lend me new force, and who knows but I may succeed. Thus was the train laid for a grand attempt. I got up as soon as Leonardo and Domingo were likely to be asleep. With the lamp in my hand, I stole out of the vault, putting up my prayers to all the spirits in paradise and 10 miles round. It was with no small difficulty that I threaded all the windings of this new labyrinth. At length I found myself at the stable door, and perceived the passage which was the object of my search. Pushing on, I made my way towards the trap with a light pair of heels and a beating heart. But alas, in the middle of my career I ran against a cursed iron grate locked fast, with bars so close as not to admit a hand between them. I looked rather foolish at the occurrence of this new difficulty, which I had not been aware of at my entrance, because the grate was then open. However, I tried what I could do by fumbling at the bars, then for a peep at the lock, or whether it could not be forced, when all at once my poor shoulders were saluted with 5 or 6 good strokes of a bull's pizzle. I set up such a shrill alarm that the den of Cacus rang with it, when looking round, who should it be but the old negro in his shirt, holding a dark lanthorn in one hand and the instrument of my punishment in the other. "Oh ho," quoth he, "my merry little fellow, you will run away, will you? No, no, you must not think to set your wits against mine. I heard you all the while. You thought you should find the grate open, did not you? You may take it for granted, my friend, that henceforth it will always be shut. When we keep anyone here against his will, he must be a cleverer fellow than you to make his escape." In the meantime, at the howl I had set up, 2 or 3 of the robbers waked suddenly, and not knowing but the Holy Brotherhood might be falling upon them, they got up and called their comrades. Without the loss of a moment, all were on the alert. Swords and carabines were put in requisition, and the whole posse advanced forward almost in a state of nature to the place where I was parleying with Domingo. But as soon as they learned the cause of the uproar, their alarm resolved itself into a peal of laughter. "How now, Gil Blas," said the apostate son of the church, "you have not been a good 6 hours with us, and are you tired of our company already? You must have a great objection to retirement. Why, what would you do if you were a Carthusian friar? Get along with you and go to bed. This time you shall get off with Domingo's discipline, but if you are ever caught in a second attempt of the same kind, by St. Bartholomew, we will flay you alive." With this hint he retired, and the rest of the party went back to their rooms. The old negro, taking credit to himself for his vigilance, returned to his stable, and I found my way back to my charnel house, where I passed the remainder of the night in weeping and wailing. End of Book 1, Chapter 6. Book 1, Chapter 7 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 7, Gil Blas, not being able to do what he likes, does what he can. For the first few days I thought I should have given up the ghost for very spite and vexation. The lingering life I led was nearly akin to death itself, but in the end my good genius whispered me to play the hypocrite. I aimed at looking a little more cheerful, began to laugh and sing, though it was sometimes on the wrong side of my mouth. In a word, I put so good a face on the matter that Leonarda and Domingo were completely taken in. They thought the bird was reconciled to his cage. The robbers entertained the same notion. I looked as brisk as the beverage I poured out, and put in my oar whenever I thought I could say a good thing. My freedom, far from offending, was taken in good part. Gil Blas, quoth the captain one evening while I was playing the buffoon, you have done well, my friend, to banish melancholy. I am delighted with your wit and humor. Some people wear a mask at first acquaintance. I had no notion what a jovial fellow you were. My praises now seemed to run from mouth to mouth. They were all so partial to me that, not to miss my opportunity, gentlemen, quoth I, allow me to tell you a piece of my mind. Since I have been your guest, a new light breaks in upon me. I have bid adieu to vulgar prejudices, and caught a ray at the fountain of your illumination. I feel that I was born to be your knight companion. I languish to make one among you, and will stand my chance of a halter with the best. All the company cried, Hear! I was considered as a promising member of the Senate. It was then determined unanimously to give me a trial in some inferior department, afterwards to bespeak me a good desperate encounter in which I might show my prowess, and if I answered expectation, to give me a high and responsible employment in the Commonwealth. It was necessary, therefore, to go on exhibiting a copy of my countenance and doing my best in my office of cupbearer. I was impatient beyond measure, for I only aspired, after the honors of the sitting, to obtain the liberty of going abroad with the rest, and I was in hopes that by running the risk of getting my neck into one noose I might get it out of another. This was my only chance. The time, nevertheless, seemed long to wait, and I kept my eye on Domingo with the hope of outwitting him. But the thing was not feasible. He was always on the watch. Orpheus, as leader of the band, with a complete orchestra of performers as good as himself, could not have soothed the savage breast of this Cerberus. The truth is, by the by, that for fear of exciting his suspicion, I did not set my wits against him so much as I might have done. He was on the lookout, and I was obliged to play the prude, or my virtue might have come into disgrace. I therefore stopped proceedings till the time of my probation should expire, to which I looked forward with impatience, just as if I was waiting for a place under government. Heaven be praised, in about 6 months I gained my end. The Commandant Rolando, addressing his regiment, said, Comrades, we must stand upon honor with Gil Blas. I have no bad opinion of our young candidate. We shall make something of him. If you will take my advice, let him go and reap his first harvest with us tomorrow on the King's highway. We will lead him on in the path of honor. The robbers applauded the sentiments of the captain with a thunder of acclamation, and to show me how much I was considered as one of the gang, from that moment they dispensed with my attendance at the sideboard. Dame Leonarda was reinstated in the office from which she had been discharged to make room for me. They made me change my dress, which consisted in a plain short cassack, a good deal the worse for wear, and tricked me out in the spoils of a gentleman lately robbed. After this inauguration, I made my arrangements for my first campaign. End of Book 1, Chapter 7. Book 1, Chapter 8 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 8, Gil Blas goes out with the gang and performs an exploit on the highway. It was past midnight in the month of September when I issued from the subterraneous abode as one of the fraternity. I was armed, like them, with a carabine, 2 pistols, a sword, and a bayonet, and was mounted on a very good horse, the property of the gentleman in whose costume I appeared. I had lived so long like a mole underground that the daybreak could not fail of dazzling me, but my eyes got reconciled to it by degrees. We passed close by Pontferrada and were determined to lie in ambush behind a small wood skirting the road to Lyons. There we were waiting for whatever fortune might please to throw in our way, when we espied a Dominican friar mounted, contrary to the rubric of those pious fathers, on a shabby mule. God be praised, exclaimed the captain with a sneer. This is a noble beginning for Gil Blas. Let him go and trounce that monk. We will bear witness to his qualifications. The connoisseurs were all of opinion that this commission suited my talents to a hair, and exhorted me to do my best. Gentlemen, quoth I, you shall have no reason to complain. I will strip this holy father to his birthday suit, and give you complete right and title to his mule. No, no, said Rolando, the beast would not be worth its fodder. Only bring us our reverend pastor's purse. That is all we require. Hereupon I issued from the wood and pushed up to the man of God, doing penance all the time in my own breast for the sin I was committing. I could have liked to have turned my back upon my fellows at that moment, but most of them had the advantage of better horses than mine. Had they seen me making off, they would have been at my heels and would soon have caught me, or perhaps would have fired a volley, for which I was not sufficiently case-hardened. I could not therefore venture on so perilous an alternative, so that claiming acquaintance with the Reverend Father, I asked to look at his purse, and just put out the end of a pistol. He stopped short to gaze upon me, and without seeming much frightened, said, My child, you are very young. This is an early apprenticeship to a bad trade. Father, replied I, bad as it is, I wish I had begun it sooner. What, my son, rejoined the good friar, who did not understand the real meaning of what I said. How say you? What blindness! Give me leave to place before your eyes the unhappy condition. Come, come, father, interrupted I with impatience, a truce to your morality, if you please. My business on the high road is not to hear sermons. Money makes my mare to go. Money, said he, with a look of surprise. You have a poor opinion of Spanish charity if you think that people of my stamp have any occasion for such trash upon their travels. Let me undeceive you. We are made welcome wherever we go, and pay for our board and lodgings by our prayers. In short, we carry no cash with us on the road, but draw drafts upon Providence. That is all very well, replied I, yet for fear your drafts should be dishonored, you take care to keep about you a little supply for present need. But come, father, let us make an end. My comrades in the wood are in a hurry, so your money or your life. At these words, which I pronounced with a determined air, the friar began to think the business grew serious. Since needs must, said he, there is wherewithal to satisfy your craving. A word and a blow is the only rhetoric with you gentlemen. As he said this, he drew a large leathern purse from under his gown and threw it on the ground. I then told him he might make the best of his way, and he did not wait for a second bidding, but stuck his heels into the mule, which, giving the lie to my opinion, for I thought it on a par with my uncle's, set off at a good round pace. While he was riding for his life, I dismounted. The purse was none of the lightest. I mounted again and got back to the wood, where those nice observers were waiting with impatience to congratulate me on my success. I could hardly get my foot out of the stirrup, so eager were they to shake hands with me. "Courage, Gil Blas," said Rolando. "You have done wonders. I have had my eyes on you during your whole performance, and have watched your countenance. I have no hesitation in predicting that you will become in time a very accomplished highwayman." The lieutenant and the rest chimed in with the prophecy, and assured me that I could not fail of fulfilling it hereafter. I thanked them for the elevated idea they had formed of my talents, and promised to do all in my power not to discredit their penetration. After they had lavished praises, the effect rather of their candor than of my merit, they took it into their heads to examine the booty I had brought under my convoy. "Let us see," said they, "let us see how a friar's purse is lined." "It should be fat and flourishing," continued one of them, "for these good fathers do not mortify the flesh when they travel." The captain untied the purse, opened it, and took out 2 or 3 handfuls of little copper coins, an Agnus Dei here and there, and some scapularies. At sight of so novel a prize, all the privates burst into an immoderate fit of laughter. "God be praised," cried the lieutenant. "We are very much obliged to Gil Blas. His first attack has produced a supply very seasonable to our fraternity." One joke brought on another. These rascals, especially the fellow who had retired from the church to our subterraneous hermitage, began to make themselves merry on the subject. They said 1,000 good things, such as showed at once the sharpness of their wits and the profligacy of their morals. They were all on the broad grin except myself. It was impossible to be butt and marksman too. They each of them shot their bolt at me, and the captain said, "Faith, Gil Blas, I would advise you as a friend not to set your wit a second time against the church. The biter may be bit, for you must live some time longer among us before you are a match for them." End of Book 1, Chapter 8. Book 1, Chapter 9 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 9, A More Serious Incident. We lounged about the wood for the greater part of the day without lighting on any traveler to pay toll for the friar. At length we were beginning to wear our homeward way, as if confining the feats of the day to this laughable adventure, which furnished a plentiful fund of conversation, when we got intelligence of a carriage on the road drawn by 4 mules. They were coming at a hard gallop, with 3 outriders who seemed to be well armed. Rolando ordered the troop to halt and hold a council, the result of whose deliberations was to attack the enemy. We were regularly drawn up in battle array and marched to meet the caravan. In spite of the applause I had gained in the wood, I felt an oozing sort of tremor come over me, with a chill in my veins and a chattering in my teeth that seemed to bode me no good. As it never rains but it pours, I was in the front of the battle, hemmed in between the captain and the lieutenant, who had given me that post of honor, that I might lose no time in learning to stand fire. Rolando, observing the low ebb of my animal spirits, looked askew at me and muttered in a tone more resolute than courtly, "Hark ye, Gil Blas, look sharp about you. I give you fair notice that if you play the recreant, I shall lodge a couple of bullets in your brain." I believed him as firmly as my catechism, and thought it high time not to neglect the hint, so that I was obliged to lay an embargo on the expression of my fears and to think only of recommending my soul to God in silence. While all this was going on, the carriage and horsemen drew near. They suspected what sort of gentry we were, and guessing our trade by our badge, stopped within gunshot. They had carabines and pistols as well as ourselves. While they were preparing to give us a brisk reception, there jumped out of the coach a well-looking gentleman, richly dressed. He mounted a led horse and put himself at the head of his party. Though they were but 4 against 9, for the coachman kept his seat on the box, they advanced towards us with a confidence calculated to redouble my terror. Yet I did not forget, though trembling in every joint, to hold myself in readiness for a shot. But to give a candid relation of the affair, I blinked and looked the other way in letting off my piece, so that from the harmlessness of my fire I was sure not to have murder to answer for in another world. I shall not give the particulars of the engagement. Though present, I was no eye-witness, and my fear, while it laid hold of my imagination, drew a veil over the anticipated horror of the sight. All I know about the matter is that after a grand discharge of musketry, I heard my companions hallooing victory, victory, as if their lungs were made of leather. At this shout, the terror which had made a forcible entry on my senses was ejected, and I beheld the 4 horsemen stretched lifeless on the field of battle. On our side we had only 1 man killed. This was the renegade parson, who had now filled the measure of his apostasy, and paid for jesting with scapularies and such sacred things. The lieutenant received a slight wound in the arm, but the bullet did little more than graze the skin. Master Rolando was the first at the coach door. Within was a lady of from 4 to 25, beautiful as an angel in his eyes, in spite of her sad condition. She had fainted during the conflict, and her swoon still continued. While he was fixed like a statue on her charms, the rest of us were in profound meditation on the plunder. We began by securing the horses of the defunct, for these animals, frightened at the report of our pieces, had got to a little distance after the loss of their riders. For the mules, they had not wagged a hair, though the coachman had jumped from his box during the engagement to make his escape. We dismounted for the purpose of unharnessing and loading them with some trunks tied before and behind the carriage. This settled, the captain ordered the lady, who had not yet recovered her faculties, to be set on horseback before the best mounted of the robbers. Then, leaving the carriage and the uncased carcasses by the roadside, we carried off with us the lady, the mules, and the horses. End of Book 1, Chapter 9. Book 1, Chapter 10 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 10, The Lady's Treatment from the Robbers, the Event of the Great Design, conceived by Gil Blas. The night had another hour to run when we arrived at our subterraneous mansion. The first thing we did was to lead our cavalry to the stable, where we were obliged to groom them ourselves, as the old negro had been confined to his bed for 3 days with a violent fit of the gout and an universal rheumatism. He had no member supple but his tongue, and that he employed in testifying his indignation by the most horrible impieties. Leaving this wretch to curse and swear by himself, we went to the kitchen to look after the lady. So successful were our attentions that we succeeded in recovering her from her fit. But when she had once more the use of her senses, and saw herself encompassed by strangers, she knew the extent of her misfortune, and shuddered at the thought. All that grief and despair together could present, of images the most distressing, appeared depicted in her eyes, which she lifted up to heaven, as if in reproach for the indignities she was threatened with. Then, giving way at once to these dreadful apprehensions, she fell again into a swoon. Her eyelids closed once more, and the robbers thought that death was going to snatch from them their prey. The captain, therefore, judging it more to the purpose to leave her to herself than to torment her with any more of their assistance, ordered her to be laid on Leonarda's bed, and at all events to let nature take its course. We went into the hall, where one of the robbers, who had been bred a surgeon, looked at the lieutenant's arm and put a plaster to it. After this scientific operation, it was thought expedient to examine the baggage. Some of the trunks were filled with laces and linen, others with various articles of wearing apparel, but the last contained some bags of coin, a circumstance highly approved by the receivers general of the estate. After this investigation, the cook set out the sideboard, laid the cloth, and served up supper. Our conversation ran first on the great victory we had achieved. On this subject, said Rolando, directing himself to me, confess the truth, Gil Blas. You cannot deny that you were devilishly frightened. I candidly admitted the fact, but promised to fight like a crusader after my second or third campaign. Hereupon all the company took my part, alleging the sharpness of the action in my excuse, and that it was very well for a novice, not yet accustomed to the smell of powder. We next talked of the mules and horses just added to our subterraneous stud. It was determined to set off the next morning before daybreak and sell them at Mansilla, before there was any chance of our expedition having got wind. This resolution taken, we finished our supper and returned to the kitchen to pay our respects to the lady. We found her in the same condition. Nevertheless, though the dregs of life seemed almost exhausted, some of these poachers could not help casting a wicked leer at her, and giving visible signs of emotion within them, which would have broken out into overt act, had not Rolando put a spoke in their wheel by representing that they ought at least to wait till the lady had got rid of her terrors and squeamishness and could come in for her share of the amusement. Their respect for the captain operated as a check to the incontinence of their passions. Nothing else could have saved the lady, nor would death itself probably have secured her from violation. Again, therefore, did we leave this unhappy female to her melancholy fate. Rolando contented himself with charging Leonarda to take care of her, and we all separated for the night. For my part, when I went to bed, instead of courting sleep, my thoughts were wholly taken up with the lady's misfortunes. I had no doubt of her being a woman of quality, and thought her lot, on that account, so much the more piteous. I could not paint to myself without shuddering the horrors which awaited her, and felt myself as sensibly affected by them as if united to her by the ties of blood or friendship. At length, after having sufficiently bewailed her destiny, I mused on the means of preserving her honor from its present danger, and myself from a longer abode in this dungeon. I considered that the old negro could not stir, and recollected that since his illness the cook had the key of the grate. That thought warmed my fancy and gave birth to a project not to be hazarded lightly. The stages of its execution were the following. I pretended to have the colic. A lad in the colic cannot help whining and groaning, but I went further and cried out lustily, as loud as my lungs would let me. This roused my gentle friends and brought them about me to know what the deuce was the matter. I informed them that I had a swinging fit of the gripes, and to humor the idea gnashed my teeth, made all manner of wry faces, till I looked like a bedlamite, and twisted my limbs as if I had been going to be delivered of a heathen oracle. Then I became calm all at once, as if my pains had abated. The next minute I flounced up and down upon my bed, and threw my arms about at random. In a word, I played my part so well that these more experienced performers, knowing as they were, suffered themselves to be thrown off their guard, and to believe that my malady was real. All at once did they busy themselves for my relief. One brought me a bottle of brandy and forced me to gulp down half of it. Another, in spite of my remonstrances, applied oil of sweet almonds in a very offensive manner. A third went and made a napkin burning hot to be clapped upon my stomach. In vain did I cry mercy. They attributed my noise to the violence of my disorder, and went on inflicting positive evil by way of remedy for that which was artificial. At last, able to bear it no longer, I was obliged to swear that I was better, and entreat them to give me quarter. They left off killing me with kindness, and I took care not to complain any more, for fear of experiencing their tender attentions a second time. This scene lasted nearly 3 hours, after which the robbers, calculating it to be near daybreak, prepared for their journey to Mansilla. I was for getting up, as if I had set my heart on being of the party, but that they would not allow. No, no, Gil Blas, said Signor Rolando, stay here, my lad. Your colic may return. You shall go with us another time. Today you are not in traveling condition. I did not think it prudent to urge my attendance too much, for fear of being taken at my word, but only affected great disappointment with so natural an air that they all went off without the slightest misgiving of my design. After their departure, for which I had prayed most fervently, I said to myself, now is your time, Gil Blas, to be firm and resolved. Arm yourself with courage to go through with an enterprise so propitiously begun. Domingo is tied by the leg, and Leonarda may show her teeth, but she cannot bite. Pounce down upon opportunity while it offers. You may wait long enough for another. Thus did I spirit myself up in soliloquy. Having got out of bed, I laid hold of my sword and pistols, and away I went to the kitchen. But before I made my appearance, I stopped to hear what Leonardo was talking about to the fair incognita, who was come to her senses, and on a view of her misfortune in its extremity, took on most desperately. That is right, my girl, said the old hag. Cry your eyes out, sob away plentifully. You know the good effect of woman's tears. The sudden shock was too much for you, but the danger's over now. The engines can play. Your grief will abate by little and little, and you will get reconciled to living with our gentlemen, who are very good sort of people. You will be better off than a princess. You do not know how fond they will be of you. Not a day will pass without your being obliged to some of them. Many a woman would give one of her eyes to be in your place. I did not allow Leonardo time to go on any longer with this babbling. In I went, and putting a pistol to her breast, insisted with a menacing air on her delivering up the key of the grate. She did not know what to make of my behavior, and though almost in the last stage of life, had such a propensity to linger on the road as not to venture on a refusal. With the key in my hand, I directed the following speech to the distressed object of my compassion. Madam, Heaven sends you a deliverer in me. Follow, and I will see you safe whithersoever you wish to be conducted. The lady was not deaf to my proposal, which made such an impression on her grateful heart that she jumped up with all the strength she had left, threw herself at my feet, and conjured me to save her honor. I raised her from the ground and assured her she might rely on me. I then took some ropes, which were opportunely in the kitchen, and with her assistance tied Leonarda to the legs of a large table, protesting that I would kill her if she only breathed a murmur. After that, lighting a candle, I went with the incognita to the treasury, where I filled my pockets with pistoles, single and double, as full as they could hold. To encourage the lady not to be scrupulous, I begged she would think herself at home and make free with her own. With our finances thus recruited, we went towards the stable, where I marched in with my pistols cocked. I was of opinion that the old blackamoor, for all his gout and rheumatism, would not let me saddle and bridle my horse peaceably, and my resolution was to put a finishing hand to all his ailments if he took it into his head to play the churl. But by good luck he was at that moment in such pain that I stole the steed without his perceiving that the door was open. The lady in the meantime was waiting for me. We were not long in threading the passage leading to the outlet, but reached the grate, opened it, and at last got to the trap. Much ado there was to lift it, which we could not have done but for the new strength we borrowed from the hopes of our escape. Day was beginning to dawn when we emerged from that abyss. Our first object was to get as far from it as possible. I jumped into the saddle, the lady got up behind me, and taking the first path that offered, we soon galloped out of the forest. Coming to some crossroads, we took our chance. I trembled for fear of its leading to Mansilla and our encountering Rolando and his comrades. Luckily, my apprehensions were unfounded. We got to Astorga by 2:00 in the afternoon. The people looked at us as if they had never seen such a sight before as a woman riding behind a man. We alighted at the first inn. I immediately ordered a partridge and a young rabbit to the spit. While my orders were in a train of execution, the lady was shown to a room where we began to scrape acquaintance with one another, which we had not done on the road on account of the speed we made. She expressed a high sense of my services, and told me that after so gentlemanly a conduct, she could not allow herself to think me one of the gang from whom I had rescued her. I told her my story to confirm her good opinion. By these means I entitled myself to her confidence and to the knowledge of her misfortunes, which she recounted to the following effect. End of Book 1, Chapter 10. Book 1, Chapter 11 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 11, The History of Doña Mencia de Mosquera. I was born at Valladolid and am called Doña Mencia de Mosquera. My father, Don Martin, after spending most of his family estate in the service, was killed in Portugal at the head of his regiment. He left me so little property that I was a bad match, though an only daughter. I was not, however, without my admirers, notwithstanding the mediocrity of my fortune. Several of the most considerable cavaliers in Spain sought me in marriage. My favorite was Don Alvar de Mello. It is true he had a prettier person than his rivals, but more solid qualities determined me in his favor. He had wit, discretion, valor, probity, and in addition to all these, an air of fashion. Was an entertainment to be given, his taste was sure to be displayed. If he appeared in the lists, he always fixed the eyes of the beholders on his strength and dexterity. I singled him out from among all the rest and married him. A few days after our nuptials, he met Don Andrew de Baeza, who had been his rival, in a private place. They attacked one another sword in hand, and Don Andrew fell. As he was nephew to the corregidor of Valladolid, a turbulent man violently incensed against the house of Mello, Don Alvar thought he could not soon enough make his escape. He returned home speedily and told me what had happened while his horse was getting ready. "My dear Mencia," said he at length, "we must part. You know the corregidor. Let us not flatter ourselves. He will hunt me even to death. You are unacquainted with his influence. This empire will be too hot to hold me." He was so penetrated by his own grief and mine as not to be able to articulate further. I made him take some cash and jewels, then he folded me in his arms, and we did nothing but mingle our sighs and tears for a quarter of an hour. In a short time the horse was at the door. He tore himself from me and left me in a condition not easily to be expressed. It had been well if the excess of my affliction had destroyed me. How much pain and trouble might I have escaped by death! Some hours after Don Alvar was gone, the corregidor became acquainted with his flight. He set up a hue and cry after him, sparing no pains to get him into his power. My husband, however, eluded his pursuit and got into safe quarters, so that the judge, finding himself reduced to confine his vengeance to the poor satisfaction of confiscating, where he meant to execute, labored to good purpose in his vocation. Don Alvar's little property all went to the hammer. I remained in a very comfortless situation, with scarcely the means of subsistence. A retired life was best suited to my circumstances, with a single female servant. I passed my hours in lamenting, not on indigence, which I bore patiently, but the absence of a beloved husband, of whom I received no accounts. He had indeed pledged himself in the melancholy moments of our parting to be punctual in acquainting me with his destiny, to whatever part of the world his evil star might conduct him. And yet 7 years rolled on without my hearing of him. My suspense respecting his fate afflicted me most deeply. At last I heard of his falling in battle under the Portuguese banner in the kingdom of Fez. A man newly returned from Africa brought me the account, with the assurance that he had been well acquainted with Don Alvar de Mello, had served with him in the army, and had seen him drop in the action. To this narrative of facts he added several collateral circumstances, which left me no room to doubt of my husband's premature death. About this time Don Ambrosio Messia Carrillo, Marquis de la Guardia, arrived at Valladolid. He was one of those elderly noblemen who, with that good breeding acquired by long experience in courts, throw their years into the background and retain the faculty of making themselves agreeable to our sex. One day he happened by accident to hear the story of Don Alvar, and from the part I bore in it and the description of my person, there arose a desire of being better acquainted. To satisfy his curiosity, he made interest with one of my relations to invite me to her house. The gentleman was one of the party. This first interview made not the less impression on his heart for the traces of sorrow which were too obvious on my countenance. He was touched by its melancholy and languishing expression, which gave him a favorable forecast of my constancy. Respect, rather than any warmer sentiment, might perhaps be the inspirer of his wishes, for he told me more than once what a miracle of good faith he considered me, and my husband's fate as enviable in this respect, however lamentable in others. In a word, he was struck with me at first sight, and did not wait for a review of my pretensions, but at once took the resolution of making me his wife. The intervention of my kinswoman was adopted as the means of inducing me to accept his proposal. She paid me a visit, and in the course of conversation pleaded that as my husband had submitted to the decree of Providence in the kingdom of Fez, according to very credible accounts, it was no longer rational to coop up my charms. I had shed tears enough over a man to whom I had been united, but for a few moments, as it were, and I ought to avail myself of the present offer, and had nothing to do but to step into happiness at once. In furtherance of these arguments, she set forth the old Marquise's pedigree, his wealth, and high character. But in vain did her eloquence expatiate on his endowments, for I was not to be moved. Not that my mind misgave me respecting Don Alvar's death, nor that the apprehension of his sudden and unwelcome appearance hereafter checked my inclinations. My little liking, or rather my extreme repugnance to a second marriage after the sad issue of the first, was the sole obstacle opposed to my relation's urgency. Neither was she disheartened. On the contrary, her zeal for Don Ambrosio resorted to endless stratagems. All my family were pressed into the old lord's service. So beneficial a match was not to be trifled with. They were eternally besetting, dunning, and tormenting me. In fact, my despondency, which increased from day to day, contributed not a little to my yielding. As there was no getting rid of him, I gave way to their eager suit, and was wedded to the Marquis de la Guardia. The day after the nuptials we went to a very fine castle of his near Burgos, between Guajal and Rodillas. He conceived a violent love for me. The desire of pleasing was visible in all his actions. The anticipation of my slenderest wishes was his earliest and his latest study. No husband ever regarded his wife more tenderly, no lover could pour forth more devotion to his mistress, nor would it have been possible for me to steel my heart against a return of passion, though our ages were so disproportioned, had not every soft sentiment been buried in Don Alvar's grave. But the avenues of a constant heart are barred against a second inmate. The memory of my first husband threw a damp on all the kind efforts of the second. Mere gratitude was a cold retribution for such tenderness, but it was all I had to give. Such was my temper of mind when, taking the air one day at a window in my apartment, I perceived a pleasant-looking man in the garden viewing me with fixed attention. He appeared to be a common laborer. The circumstance soon passed out of my thoughts, but the next day, having again taken my station at the window, I saw him on the self-same spot, and again found myself the object of his eager gaze. This seemed strange. I looked at him in my turn, and after an attentive scrutiny, thought I could trace the features of the unhappy Don Alvar. This seeming visit from the tombs roused all the dormant agony of my soul, and extorted from me a piercing scream. Happily, I was then alone with Inez, who of all my women engaged the largest share of my confidence. I told her what surmise had so agitated my spirits. She only laughed at the idea, and took it for granted that a slight resemblance had imposed on my fancy. Take courage, madam, said she, and do not be afraid of seeing your first husband. What likelihood is there of his being here in the disguise of a peasant? Is it even within the reach of credibility that he is yet alive? However, I will go down into the garden and talk with this rustic. I will answer for finding out who he is, and will return in all possible haste with my intelligence. Inez ran on her errand like a lapwing, but soon returned to my apartment with a face of mingled astonishment and emotion. Madam, exclaimed she, your conjecture is but too well grounded. It is indeed Don Alvar whom you have seen. He made himself known at once and pleads for a private interview. As I had the means of admitting Don Alvar instantaneously by the absence of the Marquis at Burgos, I commissioned my waiting maid to introduce him into my closet by a private staircase. Well may you imagine the hurry and agitation of my spirits. How could I support the presence of a man who was entitled to overwhelm me with reproaches? I fainted at his very footfall as he entered. They were about me in a moment, he as well as Inez, and when they had recovered me from my swoon, Don Alvar said, Madam, for heaven's sake, compose yourself. My presence shall never be the cause of pain to you, nor would I for the world expose you to the slightest anxiety. I am no savage husband come to account with you for a sacred pledge, nor do I impute to criminal motives the second contract you have formed. I am well aware that it was owing to the importunity of your friends. Your persecutions from that quarter are not unknown to me. Besides, the report of my death was current in Valladolid, and you had so much the more reason to give it credit, as no letter from me gave you any assurance to the contrary. In short, I am no stranger to your habits of life since our cruel separation, and know that necessity, not lightness of heart, has thrown you into the arms. Ah, sir, interrupted I with sobs, why will you make excuses for your unworthy wife? She is guilty since you survive. Why am I not still in the forlorn state in which I languished before my marriage with Don Ambrosio? Fatal nuptials, alas! But for these I should at least have had the consolation in my wretchedness of seeing the object of my first vows again without a blush. My dear Mencia, replied Don Alvar with a look which marked how deeply he was penetrated by my contrition, I make no complaint of you, and far from upbraiding you with your present prosperity, as heaven is my witness, I return it thanks for the favors it has showered on you. Since the sad day of my departure from Valladolid, my own fate has ever been adverse. My life has been but a tissue of misfortune, and as a surcharge of evil destiny, I had no means of letting you hear from me. Too secure in your affection, I could neither think nor dream but of the condition to which my fatal love might have reduced you. Donna Mencia in tears was the lovely but killing spectre that haunted me. Of all my miseries, your dear idea was the most acute. Sometimes, I own, I felt remorse for the transporting crime of having pleased you. I wished you had lent an ear to the suit of some happier rival, since the preference with which you had honored me was to fall so cruelly on your own head. To cut short my melancholy tale, after 7 years of suffering, more enamored than ever, I determined to see you once again. The impulse was not to be resisted, and the expiration of a long slavery having furnished me with the power of giving way to it, I have been at Valladolid under this disguise at the hazard of a discovery. There I learned the whole story. I then came to this castle and found the means of admission into the gardener's service, who has engaged me as a laborer. Such was my stratagem to obtain this private interview. But do not suppose me capable of blasting by my continuance here the happiness of your future days. I love you better than my own life. I have no consideration but for your repose, and it is my purpose, after thus unburdening my heart, to finish in exile the sacrifice of an existence which has lost its value, since no longer to be devoted to your service. No, Don Alvar, no, exclaimed I at these words. You shall never quit me a second time. I will be the companion of your wanderings, and death only shall divide us from this hour. Take my advice, replied he. Live with Don Ambrosio. Unite not yourself with my miseries, but leave me to stand under their undivided weight. These and other such entreaties he used, but the more willing he seemed to sacrifice himself to my welfare, the less did I feel disposed to take advantage of his generosity. When he saw me resolute in my determination to follow him, he all at once changed his tone, and assuming an aspect of more satisfaction, Madam, said he, since you still love Don Alvar well enough to prefer adversity with him before your present ease and affluence, let us then take up our abode at Betancos in the interior of Galicia. There I have a safe retreat. Though my misfortunes may have stripped me of all my effects, they have not alienated all my friends. Some are yet faithful, and have furnished me with the means of carrying you off. With their help, I have hired a carriage at Zamora, have bought mules and horses, and am accompanied by perhaps the 3 boldest of the Galicians. They are armed with carabines and pistols, waiting my orders at the village of Rodilas. Let us avail ourselves of Don Ambrosio's absence. I will send the carriage to the castle gate, and we will set out without loss of time. I consented. Don Alvar flew towards Rodillas, and shortly returned with his escort. My women, from the midst of whom I was carried off, not knowing what to think of this violent proceeding, made their escape in great terror. Inez only was in the secret, but she would not link her fate with mine on account of a love affair with Don Ambrosio's favorite man. I got into the carriage, therefore, with Don Alvar, taking nothing with me but my clothes and some jewels of my own before my second marriage, for I could not think of appropriating any presents of the Marquis. We traveled in the direction of Galicia, without knowing if we should be lucky enough to reach it. We had reason to fear Don Ambrosio's pursuit on his return, and that we should be overtaken by superior numbers. We went forward for 2 days without any alarm, and in the hope of being equally fortunate, the third had got into a very quiet conversation. Don Alvar was relating the melancholy adventure which had occasioned the rumor of his death, and how he recovered his freedom after 5 years of slavery, when yesterday we met upon the Leon road the banditti you were with. He it was whom they killed with all his attendants, and it is for him the tears flow, which you see me shedding at this moment. End of Book 1, Chapter 11. Book 1, Chapter 12 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 12, A Disagreeable Interruption. Donna Mencia melted into tears as she finished this recital. I allowed her to give a free passage to her sighs. I even wept myself for company, so natural is it to be interested for the afflicted, and especially for a lovely female in distress. I was just going to ask her what she meant to do in the present conjuncture, and possibly she was going to consult me on the same subject if our conversation had not been interrupted. But we heard a great noise in the inn, which drew our attention whether we would or no. It was no less than the arrival of the corregidor, attended by two alguazils and their marshalmen. They came into the room where we were. A young gentleman in their train came first up to me and began taking to pieces the different articles of my dress. He had no occasion to examine them long. By St. James, exclaimed he, this is my identical doublet. It is the very thing, and as safely to be challenged as my horse. You may commit this spark on my recognizance. He is one of the gang who have an undiscovered retreat in this country. At this discourse, which gave me to understand my accuser to be the gentleman robbed, whose spoils, to my confusion, were exclusively my own, I was without a word to say for myself, looking one way and the other, and not knowing where to fix my eyes. The corregidor, whose office was suspicion, set me down for the culprit, and, presuming on the lady for an accomplice, ordered us into separate custody. This magistrate was none of your stern, gallows-preaching fellows. He had a jocular, epigrammatic sort of countenance. God knows if his heart lay in the right place for all that. As soon as I was committed, in came he with his pack. They knew their trade and began by searching me. What a forfeit to these lords of the manor! At every handful of pistoles, what little eyes did I see them make! The corregidor was absolutely out of his wits. It was the best stroke within the memory of justice. My pretty lad, said his worship with a softened tone, we only do our duty, but do not you tremble for your bones before the time. You will not be broken on the wheel if you do not deserve it. These bloodsuckers were emptying my pockets all the time with their cursed palaver, and took from me what their betters of the shades below had the decency to leave, my uncle's 40 ducats. They stuck at nothing. Their staunch fingers with slow but certain scent routed me out from top to toe. They whisked me round and stripped me, even to the shame of modesty, for fear some sneaking portrait of the king should slink between my shirt and skin. When they could sift me no further, the corregidor thought it time to begin his examination. I told a plain tale, my deposition was taken down, and the sequel was that he carried in his train his bloodhounds and my little property, leaving me to toss without a rag upon a beggarly wisp of straw. Oh, the miseries of human life, groaned I, when I found myself in this merciless and solitary condition. Our adventures here are whimsical and out of all time and tune. From my first outset from Oviedo, I had got into a pleasant round of difficulties. Hardly had I worked myself out of one danger before I soused into another. Coming into town here, how could I expect the honor of the corregidor's acquaintance? While thus communing with my own thoughts, I got once more into the cursed doublet and the rest of the paraphernalia which had got me into such a scrape. Then, plucking up a little courage, never mind, Gil Blas, thought I, do not be chicken-hearted. What is a prison above ground after so brimstone a snuffle as thou hast had of the regions below? But alas, I hallow before I am out of the wood. I am in more experienced hands than those of Leonardo and Domingo. My key will not open this grate. I might well say so, for a prisoner without money is like a bird with its wings clipped. One must be in full feather to flutter out of distance from these jailbirds. But we left a partridge and a young rabbit on the spit. How they got off I know not, but my supper was a bit of sallow-complexioned bread with a pitcher of water to render it amenable to mastication, and thus was I destined to bite the bridle in my dungeon. A fortnight was pretty well without seeing a soul but my keeper, who had orders that I should want for nothing in the bread and water way. Whenever he made his appearance, I was inclined to be sociable and to parley a little to get rid of the blue devils, but this majestic minister was above reply. He was mum. He scarcely trusted his eyes, but to see that I did not slip by him. On the 16th day, the corregidor strutted in to this tune: "You are a lucky fellow. I have news for you. The lady is packed off for Burgos. She came under my examination before her departure, and her answers went to your exculpation. You will be at large this very day if your carrier from Peñaflor to Cacabelos agrees in the same tale. He is now in Astorga. I have sent for him and expect him here. If he confirms the story of the torture, you are your own master." At these words, I was ready to jump out of my skin for joy. The business was settled. I thanked the magistrate for the abridgment of justice with which he had deigned to favor me, and was getting to the fag end of my compliment when the muleteer arrived with an attendant before and behind. I knew the fellow's face, but he, having as a matter of course sold my cloak-bag with the contents from a deep-rooted affection to the money which the sale had brought, swore lustily that he had no acquaintance with me and had never seen me in the whole course of his life. "Oh, you villain!" exclaimed I, "go down on your knees and own that you have sold my clothes." "Prithee, have some regard to truth. Look in my face. Am not I one of those shallow young fellows whom you had the wit to threaten with the rack in the corporate town of Cacabelos?" The muleteer turned upon his toe and protested he had not the honor of my acquaintance. As he persisted in his disavowal, I was recommitted for further examination. Patience once more. It was only reducing feasts and fasts to the level of bread and water and regaling the only sense I had the means of using with the sight of my tongue-tied warden. But when I reflected how little innocence would avail to extricate me from the clutches of the law, the thought was death. I panted for my subterraneous paradise. "Take it for all in all," said I, "there were fewer grievances than in this dungeon. I was hail fellow well met with the banditti. I bandied about my jokes with the best of them and lived on the sweet hope of an escape, whereas my innocence here will only be a passport to the galleys." End of Book 1, Chapter 12. Book 1, Chapter 13 of the Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 13, The Lucky Means by which Gil Blas escaped from prison and his travels afterwards. While I passed the hours in tickling my fancy with my own gay thoughts, my adventures word for word, as I had set my hand to them, were current about the town. The people wanted to make a show of me. One after another there they came, peeping in at a little window of my prison, not too capacious of daylight, and when they had looked about them, off they went. This raree show was a novelty. Since my commitment there had not been a living creature at that window, which looked into a court where silence and horror kept guard. This gave me to understand that I was become the town talk, and I knew not whether to divine good or evil from the omen. One of my first visitors was the little chorister of Mondognedo, who had a fellow feeling with me for the rack and an equally light pair of heels. I knew him at once, and he had no qualms about acknowledging me as an acquaintance. We exchanged a kind greeting, then compared notes since our separation. I was obliged to relate my adventures in due form and order. The chorister, on his part, told me what had happened in the inn at Cacabelos, between the muleteer and the bride, after we had taken to our heels in a panic. Then, with a friendly assurance at parting, he promised to leave no stone unturned for my release. His companions of mere curiosity testified their pity for my misfortune, assuring me that they would lend a helping hand to the little chorister and do their utmost to procure my freedom. They were no worse than their word. The corregidor was applied to in my favor, who, no longer doubtful of my innocence, above all when he had heard the chorister's story, came 3 weeks afterwards into my cell. "Gil Blas," said he, "I never stand shilly-shally. Begone, you are free. You may take yourself off whenever you please. But tell me, if you were carried to the forest, could you not discover the subterraneous retreat?" "No, sir," replied I. "As I only entered in the night and made my escape before daybreak, it would be impossible to fix upon the spot." Thereupon the magistrate withdrew, assuring me that the jailer should be ordered to give me free egress. In fact, the very next moment the turnkey came into my dungeon, followed by one of his outriding establishment with a bundle of clothes under his arm. They both of them stripped me with the utmost solemnity, and without uttering a single syllable, of my doublet and breeches, which had the honour to be made of a bettermost cloth almost new. Then, having rigged me in an old frock, they shoved me out of their hospitable mansion by the shoulders. The taking I was in to see myself so ill-equipped acted as a cooler to the usual transport of prisoners at recovering their liberty. I was tempted to escape from the town without delay, that I might withdraw from the gaze of the people, whose prying eyes I could not encounter but with pain. My gratitude, however, got the better of my diffidence. I went to thank the little chorister to whom I was so much obliged. He could not help chuckling when he saw me. "That is your trim, is it?" said he. "As far as I see, you cannot complain that your case has not been sifted to the bottom." "I have nothing to say against the laws of my country," replied I. "They are as just as need be. I only wish their officers would take after them. They might have spared me my suit of clothes. I have paid for them over and over again." "I am quite of your mind," rejoined he, "but they would tell you that these are little formalities of old standing, which cannot be dispensed with. What, you are foolish enough to suppose, for instance, that your horse has been restored to its right owner? Not a word of it, if you please. The beast is at this present in the stables of the register, where it has been impounded as a witness to be brought into court. If the poor gentleman comes off with the crupper, he will be so much in pocket. But let us change the subject. What is your plan? What do you mean to do with yourself?" "I have an inclination," said I, "to take the road for Burgos. I may light on my rescued lady. She will give me a little ready cash. I shall then buy a new short cassock and betake myself to Salamanca, where I shall see what I can make of my Latin. All my trouble is how to get to Burgos. One must live on the road." "I understand you," replied he. "Take my purse. It is rather thinly lined, to be sure, but you know a chorister's dividends are not like a bishop's." At the same time he drew it from his pouch and inserted it between my hands with so good a grace that I could not do otherwise than accept it for want of a better. I thanked him as though he had made me a present of a gold mine, and tendered him 1,000 promises of recompense to be duly honored and punctually paid at doomsday. With this I left him, and skulked out of the town, not paying my respects to my other benefactors, but giving them 1,000 blessings from my heart. The little chorister had reason for speaking modestly of his purse. It was not orthodox. By good luck I had been used for these 2 months to a very slender diet, and had still a little small change left when I reached Ponte de Mula, not far from Burgos. I halted there to inquire after Donna Mencia. The hostess of the inn I put up at was a little withered, spiteful, emaciated bit of mortality. I saw at a glance by the mouths she made at me aside that my frock did not hit her fancy, and I thought it a proof of her taste. So I sat myself down at a table, ate bread and cheese, and drank a few glasses of execrable wine, such as innkeepers technically call cassacoquin. During this meal, which was of a piece with the outward appearance of the guest, I did my utmost to come to closer quarters with my landlady. Did she know the Marquis de la Guardia? Was his castle far out of town? Above all, what was become of my lady Marchioness? "You ask many questions in a breath," replied she, bridling with disdain. But I got out of her, though by hard pumping, that Don Ambrosio's castle was but a short league from Ponte de Mula. After I had done eating and drinking, as it was night, I thought it natural to go to bed, and asked for my room. "A room for you?" shrieked my landlady, darting at me a glance of contempt and pride. "I have no rooms for fellows who make their supper on a bit of cheese. All my beds are bespoke. There are people of fashion expected, and our accommodations are all kept for them. But I will not be unchristian. You may lie in my barn. I suppose your soft skin will not be incommoded by the feel of straw. She spoke truth without knowing it. I took it all in silence and slunk to my roosting place, where I fell asleep like a man, the excess of whose labors are his ready passport to the blessings of repose. End of Book 1, Chapter 13. Book 1, Chapter 14 of the Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 14, Donna Mencia's reception of him at Burgos. I was no sluggard, but got up the next morning betimes. I paid my bill to the landlady, who was already stirring and seemed a little less lofty and in better humor than the evening before, a circumstance I attributed to the endeavors of 3 kind guardsmen belonging to the Holy Brotherhood. These gentlemen had slept in the inn. They were evidently on a very intimate footing with the hostess, and doubtless it was for guests of such note that all the beds were bespoke. I inquired in the town my way to the castle, where I wanted to present myself. By accident I made up to a man not unlike my landlord at Pegnaflor. He was not satisfied with answering my question to the point, but informed me that Don Ambrosio had been dead 3 weeks, and the Marchioness, his lady, had taken the resolution of retiring to a convent at Burgos, which he named. I proceeded immediately towards that town, instead of taking the road to the castle, as I had first meant to do, and flew at once to the place of Donna Mencia's retreat. I besought the attendant at the turning box to tell that lady that a young man just discharged from prison at Astorga wanted to speak with her. The nun went on the message immediately. On her return, she showed me into a parlor, where I did not wait long before Don Ambrosio's widow appeared at the grate in deep mourning. "You are welcome," said the lady. "4 days ago I wrote to a person at Astorga to pay you a visit as from me, and to tell you to come and see me the moment you were released from prison. I had no doubt of your being discharged shortly. What I told the corregidor in your exculpation was enough for that. An answer was brought that you had been set at liberty, but that no one knew what was become of you. I was afraid of not seeing you any more, and losing the pleasure of expressing my gratitude. Never mind," added she, observing my confusion at making my appearance in so wretched a garb. "Your dress is of very little consequence. After the important services you have rendered me, I should be the most ungrateful of my sex if I were to do nothing for you in return. I undertake, therefore, to better your condition. It is my duty, and the means are in my power. My fortune is large enough to pay my debt of obligation to you without putting myself to inconvenience. You know," continued she, "my story up to the time when we both were committed to prison. I will now tell you what has happened to me since. When the corregidor at Astorga had sent me to Burgos, after having heard from my own lips a faithful recital of my adventures, I presented myself at the castle of Ambrosio. My return thither excited extreme surprise, but they told me that it was too late. The Marquis, as if he had been thunderstruck at my flight, fell sick, and the physicians despaired of his recovery. Here was a new incident in the melancholy tragedy of my fate. Yet I ordered my arrival to be announced. The next moment I ran into his chamber and threw myself on my knees by his bedside, with a face running down with tears and a heart oppressed with the most lively sorrow. "Who sent for you hither?" said he as soon as he saw me. "Are you come to contemplate your own contrivance? Was it not enough to have deprived me of life, but was it necessary to satisfy your heart's desire to be an eyewitness of my death?" "My lord," replied I, "Inez must have told you that I fled with my first husband, and had it not been for the sad accident which has taken him from me forever, you never would have seen me more. At the same time, I acquainted him that Don Alvar had been killed by a banditti whose captive I had consequently been in a subterraneous dungeon. After relating the particulars of my story to the end, Don Ambrosio held out to me his hand. "It is enough," said he affectionately. "I will make no more complaints. Alas, have I in fact any right to reproach you? You were thrown once more in the way of a beloved husband, and gave me up to follow his fortunes. Can I blame such an instance of your affection? No, madam, it would have been vain to resist the will of fate. For that reason I gave orders not to pursue you. In my rival himself I could not but respect the sacred rights with which he was invested, and even the impulse of your flight seemed to have been communicated by some superior power. To close all with an act of justice, and in the spirit of reconciliation, your return hither has reestablished you completely in my affection. Yes, my dear Mencia, your presence fills me with joy, but alas, I shall not long be sensible to it. I feel my last hour to be at hand. No sooner are you restored to me than I must bid you an eternal farewell." At these touching expressions my tears flowed in torrents. I felt and expressed as much affliction as the human heart is capable of containing. I question whether Don Alvar's death, doting on him as I did, had cost me more bitter lamentations. Don Ambrosio had given way to no mistaken presage of his death, which happened on the following day, and I remained mistress of a considerable jointure settled on me at our marriage. But I shall take care to make no unworthy use of it. The world shall not see me, young as I still am, wantoning in the arms of a third husband. Besides that such levity seems irreconcilable with the feelings of any but the profligate of our sex, I will frankly own the relish of life to be extinct in me, so that I mean to end my days in this convent and to become a benefactress to it. Such was Donna Mencia's discourse about her future plans. She then drew a purse from beneath her robe and put it into my hands with this address: "Here are 100 ducats simply to furnish out your wardrobe. That done, come and see me again. I mean not to confine my gratitude within such narrow bounds." I returned her 1,000 thanks and promised solemnly not to quit Burgos without taking leave of her. Having given this pledge, which I had every inclination to redeem, I went to look out for some house of entertainment. Entering the first I met with, I asked for a room. To parry the ill opinion my frock might convey of my finances, I told the landlord that, however appearances might be against me, I could pay for my night's lodging as well as a better dressed gentleman. At this speech the landlord, whose name was Majuelo, a great banterer in a coarse way, running over me with his eyes from top to toe, answered with a cool, sarcastic grin that there was no need of any such assurance. It was evident I should pay my way liberally, for he discovered something of nobility through my disguise, and had no doubt but I was a gentleman in very easy circumstances. I saw plainly that the rascal was laughing at me, and to stop his humor before it became too convulsive, gave him a little insight into the state of my purse. I went so far as to count over my ducats on a table before him, and perceived my coin to have inclined him to a more respectful judgment. I begged the favor of him to send for a tailor. "A broker would be better," said he. "He will bring all sorts of apparel, and you will be dressed up out of hand." I approved of this advice and determined to follow it. But as the day was on the point of closing, I put off my purchase till the morrow, and thought only of getting a good supper to make amends for the miserable fare I had taken up with since my escape from the forest. End of Book 1, Chapter 14. Book 1, Chapter 15 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 15. Gil Blas dresses himself to more advantage and receives a second present from the lady, his equipage on setting out from Burgos. They served me up a plentiful fricassee of sheep's trotters, almost the whole of which I demolished. My drinking kept pace with my eating, and when I could stuff no longer, I went to bed. I lay comfortably enough, and was in hopes that a sound sleep would have the kindness without delay to commit a friendly invasion on my senses. But I could not close an eye for ruminating on the dress I should choose. What shall I do, thought I? Shall I follow my first plan? Shall I buy a short cassock and go to Salamanca to set up for a tutor? Why should I adopt the costume of a licentiate for the purpose of going into orders? Do I feel an inward call? No. If I have any call, it is quite the contrary way. I'd rather wear a sword than an apron and push my fortune in this world before I think of the next. I made it my mind to take on myself the appearance of a gentleman. Waiting for the day with the greatest impatience, its first dawn no sooner greeted my eyes than I got up. I made such an uproar in the inn as to wake the most inveterate sleeper, and called the servants out of bed, who returned my salute with a volley of curses. But they found themselves under a necessity of stirring, and I let them have no rest till they had sent for a broker. The gentleman soon made his appearance, followed by two lads, each lugging in a great bundle of green cloth. He accosted me very civilly to the following effect: "Honored sir, you are a happy man to have been recommended to me rather than anyone else. I do not mean to give my brethren an ill word. God forbid I should offer the slightest injury to their reputation. They have none to spare. But between ourselves, there is not one of them that has any bowels. They are more extortionate than the Israelites. There is not a broker but myself that has any moral sense. I keep within the bounds of a reasonable profit. I am satisfied with £1 in the penny. No, that is wrong, with a penny in the pound. Thanks to heaven, I get forward fair and softly in the world." The broker, after this preface, which I, like a fool, took for chapter and verse, told his journeymen to undo their bundles. They showed me suits of every color in the rainbow, and exposed to sale a great choice of plain cloths. These I threw aside with contempt, as thinking them too undressed. But they made me try on one which fitted me as well as if I had been measured for it, and just hit my fancy, though it was a little the worse for wear. It was a doublet with slashed sleeves, with breeches and a cloak, the whole of blue velvet with a gold embroidery. I felt a little hankering after this particular article, and attempted to beat down the price. The broker, who saw my inclination, told me I had a very correct taste. "By all that is sacred," exclaimed he, "it is plain you are no younker. Take this with you. That dress was made for one of the first nobility in the kingdom, and has not been on his back 3 times. Look at the velvet, feel it. Nothing can be richer or of better color. And for the embroidery, come now, tell truth. Did you ever see better workmanship?" "What is the price of it?" said I. "Only 60 ducats," replied he. "I have refused the money, or else I am a liar." The alternative could not fail in one proposition or the other. I bid 45. 2 or 3 would have been nearer the mark. "My worthy master," said the broker coolly, "I never ask too much. I have but one price. But here, added he, holding up the suits I had thrown aside, take these. I can afford to sell them a better bargain. All this only inflamed my eagerness to buy what I was cheapening, and as I had no idea that he would have made any abatement, I paid him down 60 ducats. When he saw how easily a fool and his money were parted, I verily believe that in spite of the moral sense he heartily repented not having taken a hint from the extortionate Israelite. But reconciling himself as well as he could to the small profit to which he professed to confine himself of a pound upon a penny, he retreated with his journeyman. I was not suffered to forget that they must have something for their trouble. I had now a cloak, a doublet, and a very decent pair of breeches. The rest of my wardrobe was to be thought of, and this took up the whole morning. I bought some linen, a hat, silk stockings, shoes, and a sword, and concluded by putting on my purchases. What pleasure was it to see myself so well accoutred! My eyes were never cloyed, as it were, with the richness of my attire. Never did peacock look at his own plumage with less philosophy. On that very day I paid a second visit to Donna Mencia, who received me with her usual affability. She thanked me over again for the service I had rendered her. On that subject rapid was the interchange of compliments. Then, wishing every kind of success, she bade me farewell, and withdrew without giving me anything but a ring worth 30 pistoles, which she begged me to keep as a remembrance. I looked very foolish with my ring. I had reckoned on a much more considerable present. Thus, little satisfied with the lady's bounty, I measured back my steps in a very musing attitude. But as I entered the inn door, a man overtook me, and throwing off his wrapping cloak, discovered a large bag under his arm. At the vision of the bag, apparently full of current coin, I stood gaping, as did most of the company present. The voice of angel or archangel could not have been sweeter than when this messenger of earthly dross, laying the bag upon the table, said, Signor Gil Blas, the Lady Marchioness desires her compliments. I bowed the bearer out with an accumulation of fine speeches, and as soon as his back was turned, pounced upon the bag like a hawk upon its quarry, and bore it between my talons to my chamber. I untied it without loss of time, and the contents were 1,000 ducats. The landlord, who had overheard the bearer, came in just as I had done counting them to know what was in the bag. The sight of my riches displayed upon a table struck him in a very forcible manner. What the devil! Here is a sum of money. So, you are the man, pursued he with a waggish sort of leer. You know how to tickle the fancies of the ladies. 24 hours only have you been in Burgos, and marchionesses, I warrant you, have surrendered at the first summons. This discourse was not so much amiss. I was half inclined to leave Majuelo in his error, for it flattered my vanity. I do not wonder young fellows are fond of passing for men of gallantry, but as yet the purity of my morals was proof against the suggestions of my pride. I undeceived my landlord by telling him Donna Mencia's story, to which he listened very attentively. Afterwards I let him into the state of my affairs, and as he seemed to take an interest in them, besought him to assist me with his advice. He ruminated for some time, then said with a serious air, Master Gil Blas, I have taken a liking to you, and since you are candid enough to open your heart to me, I will tell you sincerely what I think would suit you best. You were evidently born for a court life. I recommend you to go thither and to get about the person of some considerable nobleman, but make a point either of getting at his secrets or administering to his pleasures. Unless you do that, it will be all lost time in his family. I know the great, they reckon nothing upon the zeal and attachment of a real friend, but only care for pimping sycophants. You have, besides, another string to your bow. You are young, with an attractive person, parts out of the question, for they are not at all times necessary. It is hard if you cannot turn the head of some rich widow or handsome wife with a broomstick for her husband. Love may ruin men of fortune, but it makes amends by feathering the nests of those who have none. My vote, therefore, is for Madrid, but you must not make your appearance there without an establishment. There, as elsewhere, people judge by the outside, and you will only be respected according to the figure you make. I will find you a servant, a tried domestic, a prudent lad, in a word, a fellow of my own creation. Buy a couple of mules, one for yourself, the other for him, and set off as fast as you can. This counsel was too palatable to be refused. On the day following, I purchased 2 fine mules and bargained with my new servant. He was a young man of 30, of a very simple and godly appearance. He told me he was a native of Galicia, by name Ambrose de la Mella. Other servants are selfish and think they never can have wages enough. This fellow assured me he was a man of few wants and should be contented with whatever I had the goodness to give him. I bought a pair of boots with a portmanteau to lock up my linen and my money. Having settled with my landlord, I set out from Burgos the next morning before sunrise on my way to Madrid. End of Book 1, Chapter 15. Book 1, Chapter 16 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 16, showing that prosperity will slip through a man's fingers. We slept at Dueñas the first night and reached Valladolid on the following day about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We alighted at the inn of the most respectable appearance in the town. I left the care of the mules to my fellow and went up to a room whither I ordered my portmanteau to be carried by a waiter. As I felt a little weary, I threw myself on a couch in my boots and fell asleep involuntarily. It was almost night when I awoke. I called for Ambrose. He was not to be found in the house, but made his appearance in a short time. I asked him where he had been. He answered in his godly way that he was just come from church, whither he went for the purpose of thanksgiving, by reason that we had been graciously preserved from all perils and dangers between Burgos and Valladolid. I commended his piety and ordered a chicken to be roasted for supper. At the moment when I was giving this order, my landlord came into my room with a light in his hand. That cursed candle served to introduce a lady, handsome but not young, and very richly attired. She leant upon an usher, none of the youngest, and a little blackamoor was her train-bearer. I was under no small surprise when this fair incognita, with a profound obeisance, begged to know if my name might happen to be Signor Gil Blas of Santillane. I had no sooner blundered out yes than she released her sweet hand from the custody of the usher and embraced me with a transport of joy, of which I knew less and less what to make. Heaven be praised, cried she, for all its mercies. You are he, noble sir, the very man of whom I was in quest. By this introduction I was reminded of my friend the parasite at Peñaflor, and was on the point of suspecting the lady to be no better than an honest woman should be, but her finale gave me a much higher opinion of her. I am, continued she, first cousin to Donna Mencia de Mascara, whom you have so greatly befriended. It was but this morning I received a letter from her. She writes me word that, having learnt your intention of going to Madrid, she wished me to receive you hospitably on your journey if you went this way. For these 2 hours have I been parading the town. From inn to inn have I gone to inform myself what strangers were in the house, and I gathered from the landlord's description that you were most likely to have been my cousin's deliverer. Since then I have found you out, you shall know by experience my gratitude to the friends of my family, and especially to my dear cousin's hero. You will take up your abode, if you please, at my house. Your accommodations will be better. I wished to excuse myself, and told the lady that I could not be so troublesome, but her importunities were more than a match for my modesty. A carriage was waiting at the door of the inn to convey us. She saw my portmanteau taken care of with her own eyes, because, as she justly observed, there were a great many light-fingered gentry about Valladolid. To be sure, there were a great many light-fingered gentry about Valladolid, as she justly observed. In short, I got into the carriage with her and the old usher, and suffered myself to be carried off bodily from the inn, to the great annoyance of the landlord, who saw himself thus weaned from all the little perquisites he had reckoned on from my abode under his roof. Our carriage, having rolled on some distance, stopped. We alighted at the door of a handsome house, and went upstairs into a well-furnished apartment, illuminated by 20 or 30 wax candles. Several servants were in waiting, of whom the lady inquired whether Don Raphael was come. They answered no. She then addressed herself to me. Signor Gil Blas, I am waiting for my brother's return from a country seat of ours, about 2 leagues distant. What an agreeable surprise will it be to him to find a man under his roof to whom our family is so much indebted. At the very moment she had finished this pretty speech, we heard a noise, and were informed at the same time that it was occasioned by the arrival of Don Raphael. This spark soon made his appearance. He was a young man of portly figure and genteel manners. I am in ecstasy to see you back again, brother, said the lady. You will assist me in doing the honours to Signor Gil Blas of Santillane. We can never do enough to show our sense of his kindness to our kinswoman, Donna Mencia. Here, read this letter I have just received. Don Raphael opened the envelope and read aloud as follows. My dear Camilla, Signor Gil Blas of Santillane, the saviour of my honour and my life, has just set out for court. He will, of course, pass through Valladolid. I conjure you by our family connection, and still more by our indissoluble friendship, to give him an hospitable reception, and to detain him for some time as your guest. I flatter myself that you will so far oblige me, and that my deliverer will receive every kind of polite attention from yourself and my cousin Don Raphael, your affectionate cousin, Burgos, Donna Mencia. What? Cried Don Raphael, casting his eyes again over the letter. Is it to this gentleman my kinswoman owes her honour and her life? Then heaven be praised for this happy meeting. With this sort of language he advanced towards me, and squeezing me tightly in his arms. What joy to me is it, added he, to have the honour of seeing Signor Gil Blas of Santillane. My cousin the Marchioness had no need to press the hospitality. Had she only told us simply that you were passing through Valladolid, that would have been enough. My sister Camilla and I shall be at no loss how to conduct ourselves towards a young gentleman who has conferred an obligation not to be repaid on her of all our family most tenderly beloved by us. I made the best answer I could to these speeches, which were followed by many others of the same kind, and interlarded with 1,000 bows and scrapes. But Lord bless me, he has his boots on. The servants were ordered in to take them off. We next went into another room where the cloth was lain. Down we sat at table, the brother, sister, and myself. They paid me 100 compliments during supper. Not a word escaped me, but they magnified it into an admirable hit. It was impossible not to observe the assiduity with which they both helped me out of every dish. Don Raphael often pledged me to Donna Mencia's health. I could not refuse the challenge. and it looked a little as if Camilla, who was a very good companion, ogled at me with no questionable meaning. I even thought I could perceive that she watched her opportunity, as if she was afraid of being detected by her brother. An oracle could not have convinced me more firmly that the lady was caught, and I looked forward to a little delicate amusement from the discovery during the short time I was to stay at Valladolid. That hope was my tempter to comply with the request they made me of condescending to pass a few days with them. They thanked me kindly for indulging them with my company, and Camilla's restrained but visible transport confirmed me in the opinion that I was not altogether disagreeable in her eyes. Don Raphael, finding I had made up my mind to be his guest for a few days, proposed to take me to his country house. The description of it was magnificent, and the round of amusements he meditated for me was not to be described. At one time, said he, we will take the diversion of the chase, at another that of fishing, and whenever you have a mind for a saunter, we have charming woods and gardens. In addition, we shall have agreeable society. I flatter myself you will not find the time hang heavy on your hands. I accepted the invitation, and it was agreed that we should go to this fine country house the following day. We rose from the table with this pleasant scheme in our mouths. Don Raphael seemed in ecstasy. Signor Gil Blas, said he, embracing me, I leave you with my sister. I am going presently to give the necessary orders and send invitations round to the families I wish to be of the party. With these words he sallied forth from the room where we were sitting. I went on chatting with the lady, whose topics of discourse did not belie the glances of her expressive eyes. She took me by the hand, and playing with my ring, "You have a mighty pretty brilliant there," said she, "but it is small. Are you a judge of jewelry?" I answered, "No." "I am sorry for that," resumed she, "because I was in hopes you could have told me what this is worth." As she uttered these words, she showed me a large ruby on her finger, and while I was looking at it, said, "An uncle of mine, who was governor of the Spanish settlements in the Philippine Isles, gave me this ruby. The jewelers at Valladolid value it at 300 pistoles. It cannot be worth less," said I, "for it is evidently a very fine stone." "Why then, since you have taken a fancy to it," replied she, "an exchange is no robbery." In a twinkling she whisked off my ring and placed her own on my little finger. After this exchange, a genteel way enough of making a present, Camilla pressed my hand and gazed at me with expressive tenderness. Then all at once, breaking off the conversation, wished me good night, and retired to hide her blushes, as if she had been ready to sink at the indiscreet avowal of her sentiments. No one hitherto had trod less in the paths of gallantry than myself, yet I could not shut my eyes to the vista vision opened to me by this precipitate retreat. Under these circumstances, a country excursion might have its charms. Full of this flattering idea, and intoxicated with the prosperous condition of my affairs, I locked myself into my bedroom, after having told my servant to call me betimes in the morning. Instead of going to sleep, I gave myself up to the agreeable reflections which my portmanteau snug upon the table, and my ruby excited in my breast. Heaven be praised, thought I, though misfortunes have been my lot, I am unfortunate no longer. 1,000 ducats here, a ring of 300 pistoles value there. I am in cash for a considerable time. Indeed, Majuelo was no flatterer. I see clearly. The ladies of Madrid will take fire like touchwood, since the green sticks of Valladolid are so inflammable. Then the kind regards of the generous Camilla arrayed themselves in all their charms, and I tasted by anticipation the amusements Don Raphael was preparing for me at his villa. In the meanwhile, amid so many images of pleasure, sleep was on the watch to strew his poppies on my couch. As soon as I felt myself drowsy, I undressed and went to bed. The next morning when I awoke, I found it rather late. It was odd enough that my servant did not make his appearance after such particular orders. Ambrose, thought I to myself, my devout Ambrose, is either at church or abominably lazy this morning. But I soon let go this opinion of him to take up a worse, for getting out of bed and seeing no portmanteau, I suspected him to have stolen it during the night. To clear up my suspicions, I opened my chamber door and called the religious rascal over and over again. An old man answered, saying, "What is your pleasure, sir? All your folks left my house before daybreak." "Your house? How now?" exclaimed I. "Am I not under Don Raphael's roof?" "I do not know the gentleman," said he. "You are in a ready furnished lodging, and I am the landlord. Yesterday evening, an hour before your arrival, the lady who supped with you came hither and engaged this suite of apartments for a nobleman of high rank, traveling incognito, as she called it. She paid me beforehand. I was now in the secret." It was plain enough what sort of people Camilla and Don Raphael were, and I conjectured that my servant, having wormed himself into a complete knowledge of my concerns, had betrayed me to these impostors. Instead of blaming myself for this sad accident, and considering that it could never have happened but for my indiscretion in so unnecessarily betraying my confidence to Majuelo, I gave bad language to the poor harmless Dame Fortune, and cursed my ill star in 100 different formularies. The master of the ready-furnished lodging, to whom I related the adventure, which perhaps was as much his as mine, showed some little outward sensibility to my affliction. He lamented over me, and protested he was deeply mortified that such a play should have been acted in his house. But I verily believe, notwithstanding his fine words, that he had an equal share in the cheat with mine host at Burgos, to whom I have never denied the merit of so ingenious an invention. End of Book 1, Chapter 16. Book 1, Chapter 17 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 17, the measures Gil Blas took after the adventure of the ready-furnished lodging. After the first transports of my grief were over, I began to consider that instead of giving way to remorse, I ought rather to bear up against my ill fate. I summoned back my resolution, and by way of comfort said to myself as I was dressing, "I am still in luck, that the knaves have not carried off my clothes and what little money I had in my pocket." I gave them some credit for being so considerate. They had even been generous enough to leave me my boots, which I parted with to the landlord for a third of their cost. At last I sallied out of the ready-furnished lodging, unencumbered, heaven be praised, with baggage or attendants. The first thing I did was to go and see if my mules were still at the inn where we alighted the evening before. It was not to be supposed that Ambrose would have neglected a due attention to them, and it would have been well for me if I had always taken such exact measure of his character. I learned that he had not waited for the morning, but had been careful to fetch them by overnight. Under these circumstances, satisfied I should never see them again, any more than my portmanteau, I walked sulkily along the streets, musing on the future plans I should adopt. I was tempted to go back to Burgos and once more have recourse to Donna Mencia, but regarding this as an abuse of that lady's goodness, and being aware, moreover, what a fool I should look like, I thought it best to forego that idea. I made a vow, too, for the future, to be on my guard against women. I could have sent the chaste Susanna to the house of correction. From time to time my ring caught my eye. It was a present from Camilla, and I was ready to burst with anguish. Alas, thought I am no judge of jewelry, but I shall be by experience of these hucksters who exchange without a robbery. I need not go to a jeweler to be told I am an ass. I can see my own face in my ruby. Yet I did not neglect to know the truth respecting the value of my ring, and showed it to a lapidary, who rated it at 3 ducats. At such an estimate, though as much as I expected, I made a formal surrender to the devil of the Philippine Isles, the governor and his niece. Or rather, I only restored his own subjects to their lawful sovereign. As I was going out of the lapidary's shop, a young fellow brushed by me, and on looking round made a full stop. I could not recollect his name at first, though his features were perfectly familiar to me. "How now, Gil Blas," said he, "are you ashamed of an old acquaintance, or have 2 years so altered the son of Nunez the barber that you do not know him? Do not you recollect Fabrizio, townsman and schoolfellow? How often have we kept before Dr. Godinez upon universals and metaphysics?" These words did not flow so fast as my recollection, and we embraced with mutual goodwill. "Well, my friend," resumed he, "I am overjoyed to meet with you. Words fall short, but how is this? Why, you look like, as heaven is my judge, you are dressed like a grandee. A gentleman's sword, silk stockings, a velvet doublet and cloak, embroidered with silver. Plague take it, this is getting on in the world with a vengeance. I will lay a wager you are in with some old moneyed harridan." "You reckon without your host," said I. "My affairs are not so prosperous as you imagine." "That will not do for me," replied he. "I know better things, but you have a mind to be close. And that fine ruby on your finger, Master Gil Blas, whence comes that, if I may be so bold?" "It comes," quoth I, "from an infernal jade. Fabrizio, my dear Fabrizio, far from being point, quint, and quatorze with the ladies of Valladolid, you are to know, my friend, that I am their complete bubble." I uttered these last words so ruefully that Fabrizio saw plainly that some trick had been played upon me. He was anxious to learn why I was out of humour with the lovely sex. I had no difficulty in satisfying his curiosity, but as the story was a long one, and besides we had no mind to part in a hurry, we went into a coffee shop to be a little more at ease. There I recounted to him during breakfast all that had happened to me since my departure from Oviedo. My adventures he thought whimsical enough, and, testifying his sympathy in my present uneasy circumstances, added, "We must make the best, my good lad, of all our misfortunes in this life. Is a man of parts in distress, he waits patiently for better luck. Such an one, as Cicero truly observes, never suffers himself to be humbled so low as to forget that he is a man. For my own part, that is just my character. In or out of favor, there is no sinking me. I always float on the surface of ill luck. For example, I was in love with a girl of some family at Oviedo, and was beloved by her in return. I asked her of her father in marriage. He refused. Many a young fellow would have died of grief, but no, mark my spirit, I carried off the little baggage. She was lively, heedless, and coquettish. Pleasure, consequently, was always uppermost to the prejudice of duty. I took her with me for 6 months backwards and forwards about Galicia. Thence, adopting my taste for travelling, she had a mind to go to Portugal, but in other company, more food for despair. Yet I did not give in under the weight of this new affliction, but improving on Menelaus, thought myself much obliged to the Paris who had whispered in the ear of my Helen for ridding me of a bad bargain. I therefore determined to keep the peace. After that, not finding it convenient to return to the Asturias and balance accounts with justice, I went forward into the kingdom of Leon, spending between one town and another all the loose cash remaining from the rape of my Indian princess, for we had both of us bird-limed our fingers at our departure from Oviedo. I got to Palencia with a solitary ducat, out of which I was obliged to buy a pair of shoes. The remainder would not go far. My situation became rather perplexing. I began already to be reduced to short allowance. Something must be done. I resolved to go out to service. My first place was with a woolen draper in a large way, whose son was a lad of wit and fashion. Here was a complete antidote to fasting, but then there was a little awkwardness. The father ordered me to dog the son. The son begged my assistance in imposing on the father. It was necessary to take one side or other. Entreaties sound more musical than commands, and my taste for music got me turned out of doors. The next service I entered into was with an old painter who undertook, as a matter of favor, to teach me the principles of his art. But he was so busy in feeding me with knowledge that he forgot to give me any meat. This neglect of substance foreshadowed disgusted me with my abode at Palencia. I came to Valladolid, where by the greatest good luck in the world I was hired by a governor of the hospital. I am with him still, and delighted with my quarters. My master, Signor Manuel Ordonez, is a man of profound piety. He always walks with his eyes cast downwards and a large rosary in his hand. They say that from his early youth, having been a close inspector of the poor, he has interested himself in their affairs with unwearied zeal. Charity draws down a blessing on the charitable. Everything has prospered with him. What a favorite of heaven! The more he does for the poor, the richer he grows. As Fabrizio was going on in this manner, I interrupted him. It is well you are satisfied with your lot, but between ourselves, surely you might play your part better in the world. Do not you believe it, Gil Blas, replied he. Be assured that for a man of my temper, a more agreeable situation could not possibly have been devised. The trade of a lackey is toilsome, to be sure, for a poor creature, but for a lad of spirit it is all enchantment. A superior genius, when he gets a service, does not go about it like a lumpish simpleton. He enters into a family as viceroy over the master, not as an inferior minister. He begins by measuring the length of his employer's foot. By lending himself to his weaknesses, he gains his confidence, and ends with leading him by the nose. Such has been my plan of operation at the governor's. I knew the pilgrim at once by his staff. His wish was for an earthly canonization. I pretended to believe him to be the saint he wished to be taken for. Hypocrisy costs nothing. Nay, I went further, for I took pattern by him, and playing the same part before him which he played before others, I out-cousined the cousin, and by degrees got to be major domo. I am in hopes some day or other, under his wing, to have the fingering of the poor's box. It may bring a blessing upon me as well as another, for I have caught the flame from him, and already feel deeply for the interests of charity. These are fine hopes, my dear Fabrizio, replied I, and I congratulate you upon them. For my part, I am determined on my first plan. I shall straightway convert my embroidered suit into a cassock, repair to Salamanca, and there, enlisting under the banner of the University, fulfill the sacred duties of a tutor. A fine scheme, exclaimed Fabrizio, a pleasant conceit. What madness at your age to turn pedant! Are you aware, you stupid fellow, what you take upon yourself by that choice? As soon as you are settled, all the house will be upon the watch. Your most trivial actions will be minutely sifted. You will lead a life of incessant constraint. You must set yourself off with a counterfeit outside, and affect to entertain a double set of the cardinal virtues in your bosom. You will not have a moment to bestow on pleasure. The everlasting censor of your pupil, your days will pass in teaching grammar and administering saintly reprehension when he shall say or do anything against decorum. After so much labor and confinement, what will be your reward? If the little gentleman is a pickle, they will lay all the blame on your bad management, and you will be kicked out of the family. It may be without your stipend. Do not tell me then of a tutor's employment. It is worse than a cure of souls. But talk as much as you will about a lackey's occupation, that is a sinecure and pledges you to nothing. Suppose one's master not to be immaculate. A servant of superior genius will flatter his vices, and not unfrequently turn them to account. A footman lives at his ease in a good family. After having ate and drank his fill, he goes to bed peaceably without troubling himself who pays the bills. I should never have done, my dear fellow, pursued he, were I to enumerate all the advantages of service. Trust me, Gil Blas, discard forever your foolish wish of being a tutor, and follow my example. So be it, but Fabrizio, replied I, Governors like yours are not to be met with every day, and if resolved to go to service, I should like at least to get a good situation. Oh, you are in the right, said he, and that shall be my concern. I will get you a comfortable place, if it were only to snatch a fine fellow from the jaws of the university. The near approach of poverty with which I was threatened, and Fabrizio's apparent good case having more weight with me than his arguments, I determined to wear a livery. On which we sallied forth from the tavern, and my townsman said, I am going to introduce you to a man to whom most of the servants resort when they are on the ramble. He has eavesdroppers about him to pick up all that passes in families. He knows at once where the servants are going away, and keeps a correct register, not only of vacant places, but of vacant masters, with their good and bad properties. The fellow has been a friar in some convent or other. In short, he it was who got me my place. While we were conversing about so singular an office of intelligence, the son of Nunez the barber took me into a street which had no thoroughfare. We went into a mean house, where we found a man about 50 writing at a table. We wished him good day with quite as much humility as became us, but whether it was from natural pride, or that from a habit of seeing none but lackeys and coachmen, he had got a trick of receiving his company with an easy freedom without rising from his seat. He just gave a slight nod. He seemed surprised that a young man in embroidered velvet should want a place. He had rather expected me to have wanted a servant. However, he was not kept long in doubt, since Fabrizio said at once, Signor Arias de Londona, give me leave to introduce one of my best friends. He is a youth of good connections, whom adverse circumstances have reduced to the necessity of going to service. Have the goodness to provide for him handsomely, and you may trust to his gratitude. Gentlemen, replied Arias coolly, this is the way with you all. Before you are settled, you make the finest promises in the world, but afterwards, Lord help us, your memories are very short. The deuce, replied Fabrizio. Why, you do not complain of me. Have not I done the thing genteelly? You ought to have done it much better, rejoined Arias. Your place is better than a clerk in a public office, and you paid me as if I had quartered you upon a poor author. Here I interfered and told Master Arias that to convince him I was not a shabby fellow, I would make my acknowledgments beforehand, at the same time taking out 2 ducats, with an assurance of not stopping there if he got me into a good berth. He seemed to like my mode of dealing. There are, said he, some very good places vacant. I will give you a list of them, and you shall take your choice. With these words he put on his spectacles, opened a register on the table, turned over a few of the leaves, and began reading to this effect. Captain Turbellino wants a footman. A hasty, harebrained, humorsome chap, scolds incessantly, swears, kicks his servants, and very often cripples them. Go on to the next, cried I, at this picture. Such a captain will never do for me. My sprightliness made Arias smile, and he went on with his catalogue thus. Donna Manuela de Sandoval, a superannuated dowager, peevish and fantastical, is in want at this very time. She keeps but one, and him never for 24 hours. There has been a livery in the house for these 10 years, which fits every newcomer, whether tall or short. They only just try it on, so that it is as good as new, though it has had 2,000 owners. Dr. Alvar Fanez wants a journeyman, an eminent member of the faculty. He boards his family very handsomely, has everything comfortable about him, and gives very high wages, but he is a little too fond of experiments. When he gets a parcel of bad drugs, which happens very often, there is a pretty quick succession of new servants. Oh, I do not in the least doubt it, interrupted Fabrizio with a hoarse laugh. Upon my word, you give me a fine character of your customers. Patience, said Arias de Londona. We have not yet got to the end. There is variety enough. Thereupon he continued to read on. Donna Alfonso de Solis, an old devotee, who lives 2/3 of her time at church and always keeps her servant at her apron string, has been in want for these 3 weeks. The licentiate Cedillo, an old prebendary of the chapter here, turned away his servant yesterday evening. Halt there, Signor Arias de Londona, cried Fabrizio at that passage. We will stick to the church. The licentiate Cedillo is one of my master's friends, and I am very well acquainted with him. I know he has for his housekeeper an old hypocrite called Dame Jacintha, who is complete mistress of the family. It is one of the best houses in Valladolid, a very idle life and plenty of excellent meat and drink. Besides, his reverence is an old, gouty, infirm man, likely soon to make his will. There is a legacy to be looked after. That is a delightful prospect for one of our cloth. Gil Blas, added he, turning round to me, let us lose no time, my friend, but go immediately to the licentiate's house. I will introduce you myself and give you a character. At these words, for fear of missing such an opportunity, we took a hasty leave of Signor Arias, who assured me for my money that if I failed here he would do something as good for me elsewhere. End of Book 1, Chapter 17. Book 2, Chapter 1 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 1. Fabricio introduces Gil Blas to the licentiate Sedillo and procures him a reception. The domestic economy of that clergyman, picture of his housekeeper. We were so dreadfully afraid of offending against the regular hours of the old licentiate that we made but a hop, skip, and jump from the street with one outlet to the prebendal residence. The gates were barred, but we ventured to announce our arrival. A girl of 10 years old, the housekeeper's professed niece, and slander could not gainsay the relationship, opened the door to us. As we asked to speak with his reverence, Dame Jacintha made her appearance. She was a lady of ripe person and parts, but by no means past her prime, and I was particularly attracted by the clearness of her complexion. She wore a long woolen gown of the most ordinary quality, with a large leathern girdle whence hung suspended a bunch of keys on one side, and on the other a tremendous string of beads. As soon as we got a glimpse of her, we made our obeisances with all possible reverence. She returned our salutation with similar good breeding, but with an air of modesty, and eyes communing with the ground. I have been told, said my fellow servant, that the Reverend the Licentiate Sedillo wants an honest lad, and I have one at his service with whom he will be well satisfied. The superintendent of the household turned up her eyes at these words with a significant side glance at me, and finding it difficult to reconcile my laced jacket with Fabrizio's exordium, asked if it was this fine gentleman who was come after the place. Yes, said the son of Nunez, it is this interesting and engaging youth. Just as you see him, the ups and downs of this transitory life have compelled him to wear an epaulette. But fate will have made him ample amends, added he with an affected languish, if he is so happy as to be an inmate here and to profit by the society of the virtuous Jacintha. The patriarch of the Indies might have sighed for the virtuous Jacintha at the head of his establishment. At these words, this withered branch of piety withdrew her penetrating regards from me to contemplate this courteous spokesman. Struck with certain lines which were not new to her in his face, I had some floating idea of having seen you before, said she, but my memory wants a lift. Holy Jacintha, replied Fabrizio, it is enough for me to have been blessed with your pious notice. Twice have I been under this venerable roof with my master, Signor Manuel Ordonez, governor of the hospital. Ah, just so, answered the lady chamberlain, I recollect. You are an old acquaintance. Well a day now. Your very belonging to Signor Ordonez is enough to prove you a youth of merit and strict propriety. A servant is known by his place, and this lad could not have had a better sponsor. Come along with me. I will introduce you to Signor Sedillo. I am sure he will be glad to engage a lad at your recommendation. We followed Dame Jacintha. The canon lived in the lower part of the house in a comfortable suite of wainscoted apartments. She begged us to wait a moment in the antechamber while she went into the licentiate's room. After some private parley with him, merely that he might know what he was about, she came to tell us we might walk in. We kenned the old cripple, immersed in an elbow chair, with a pillow under his head, cushions under his arms, and his legs supported on a large stool stuffed with down. We were no niggards of our bows as we advanced, and Fabrizio, still taking the lead, not only repeated over again what he had said to the housekeeper, but set about extolling my merit, and expatiated in an especial manner on the honors I had gained in the schools under Dr. Godinez on all metaphysical questions, as if it was necessary for a prebendary's footman to be as learned as his master. However that might be, it served as a tub to the whale. Besides, Dame Jacintha did not look forbidding, and my surety received the following answer: "Friend, I receive into my service the lad you recommend. I like him well enough, and as for his morals, they cannot be much amiss, since he presents himself under the wing of a domestic belonging to Signor Ordonez." As soon as Fabrizio saw me safe landed, he made a low bow to the prebendary, a still lower to the lady, and withdrew in high good humor, whispering in my ear that we should meet again, and that I had only to make good my footing. As soon as he had left the room, the licentiate inquired my name, why I had left my native place, and drew me on by his questions to relate my adventures before Dame Jacintha. They were both highly amused, above all by my last rencontre. Camilla and Don Raphael gave such play to their risible muscles that I thought old Chalkstone would have burst, for as he laughed with all his might, so violent a cough laid hold of him as went very near to have carried him off. His will was not made. What an alarm for the housekeeper! Trembling, distracted, off she flew to the good man's succor, and just like a nurse with a puking child, paddled about his forehead and tapped him on the back. Luckily, it was a false alarm. The old gentleman left off coughing, and the housekeeper tormenting him. When it was over, I was for going on with my narrative, but Dame Jacintha, in awe of a second fit, set herself against it. She therefore took me with her out of the room to a wardrobe where, among several suits, was that of my predecessor. This I was to take and leave my own in its room, which I was not sorry to see laid up safe, in the hope it might be of further use. After this we went together to get dinner ready. I knew what I was about in the art of dressing meat. Dame Leonarda, with whom I had served my time, might have passed for a very decent plain cook, but a mere turnspit to Dame Jacintha. The latter might almost have borne away the bell from the Archbishop of Toledo's man. She was mistress of everything, gravy, soups of the most delicious texture and relish, and for made dishes she could season them up or soften them down to the most delicate or voluptuous palate. At dinner time we returned to his reverence's apartment. While I was arranging the grand concern close by his armchair, the lady of all work crammed a napkin under the old boy's chin and pinned it behind his back. Without losing a moment, in marched I with a stew fit to be set before the first gourmand in Madrid, and 2 courses to have tickled the gills of a viceroy, only that Dame Jacintha had touched the spice box with discretion for fear of exasperating the gout. At the first glimpse of this goodly mess, my old master, whom I conceived to have lost the use of his limbs, made me to understand that his arms were exempted from the interdict. He availed himself of their assistance to get clear of his pillow and cushions, and proceeded gaily to the attack. His hand shook, to be sure, but somehow or other it contrived to do its duty. He sent it backwards and forwards fast enough, though it brought but half its cargo to the landing place at a lading. The tablecloth and napkin took toll. I carried off the soup when he had done, and brought in a partridge flanked by 2 roast quails, which Dame Jacintha cut up for him. She took care to make him take a good draught of wine, a little lowered at proper intervals out of a large deep silver cup which she held to his mouth, as if he had been an infant. He winged the partridge and came down slapdash upon all the rest of the dishes. When he had done cramming, that saint of the saucepan unpinned his napkin, reinstated his pillow and cushions, then leaving him composed in his armchair to the enjoyment of his usual nap after dinner, we took away and demolished the remainder with appetites worthy of our master. The dinner of today was the ordinary bill of fare. Our canon played the best knife and fork in the chapter. But the supper was a mere bauble, seldom more than a chicken and a little confectionery. I larded my inside in this house and led a good, easy life. There was but one awkward circumstance, and that was sitting up with my master to save the expense of a nurse. Besides the strangery which kept him on the fidget 10 times in an hour, he was very much given to perspire, and in that event I shifted him. Gil Blas, said he on the second night, you are an active, clever fellow. I foresee that we shall jog on very well together. I only just give you a hint to keep in with Dame Jacintha. The girl has been about me for these 15 years and manages all my little matters. She comforts my outward man, and I cannot do too much for her. For that reason you ought to know that she is more to me than all my family. There is my nephew, my own sister's son. Why, I have turned him out of doors only to please her. He had no regard for the poor lass, and so far from giving her credit for all her little assiduities, the saucy rascal swore she did not care a farthing for me. But nowadays young people think virtue and gratitude all a farce. Heaven be praised, I am rid of the varlet. What claim has blood in comparison with unquestionable attachment? I am influenced by a give-and-take principle in my connections. You are right, sir, replied I. Gratitude ought to be the first thing, and natural affection the last. Ay, resumed he, and my will shall be a comment on that text. My housekeeper shall be residuary legatee, and you shall have a corner in a codicil if you go on as well as you have begun. The footman I turned off yesterday has lost a good legacy by not knowing where to hit the right nail on the head. If the blockhead had not obliged me by his ill behavior to send him packing, I would have made a man of him, but the beggar on horseback gave himself airs to Dame Jacintha. Then Master Lazybones did not like sitting up. I might pass the night as I could, provided he had no trouble with me. Oh, the unfeeling scoundrel, exclaimed I, in the true spirit of Fabrizio. He was not a man to be about so good a master. The lad for your money should be a humble but confidential friend. He should not make a toil of what ought to be a pleasure, but think nothing of going through fire and water for your ease. These professions were not lost upon the licentiate, neither were my assurances of due submission to Dame Jacintha's authority less acceptable. Puffing myself off for a servant who was not afraid of work, I got through my business as cheerfully as I could. I never complained of my nursery, though to be sure it was irksome enough, and if the legacy had not settled my stomach, I should have sickened at the nature of my employment. It is true I got some hours' rest during the day. The housekeeper, to do her justice, was kind enough to me, owing to the insinuating manner in which I wormed myself into her good graces. Supposed me at table with her and her niece Inesilla. I changed their plates, filled their glasses, never thought of my own dinner before they had everything they wanted. This was the way to thrive in their esteem. One day when Dame Jacintha was gone to market, finding myself alone with Inesilla, I began to make myself agreeable. Were her father and mother alive? Oh, no, answered she. They have been dead this long, long time, for my good aunt says they have, and I have never seen them. I religiously believed the little innocent, though her answer was not of the clearest, and she got into such an humor of talking as to tell me more than I wanted to know. She informed me, or rather I inferred it from her artless simplicity, that her good aunt had a good friend, who lived likewise with an old canon. The temporalities of the church were under his administration, and these lucky domestics reckoned upon entwining the spoils of their masters round the pillars of the hymeneal temple, into whose sanctuary they had penetrated by anticipation. Dame Jacintha, as I have said before, though a little stricken in years, had still some bloom. To be sure, she spared no pains to cherish it. Besides daily evacuations, she took plentiful doses of all-powerful jelly. She got her sleep in the night, too, while I sat up with my master. But what perhaps contributed most to the freshness of this everlasting flower was an issue in each leg, of which I should never have known but for that blab Inesilla. End of Book 2, Chapter 1. Book 2, Chapter 2 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain René Lesage, translated by Tobias Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 2, The Canon's Illness, His Treatment, the Consequence, the Legacy to Gil Blas. I stayed 3 months with the licentiate Cedillo without complaining of bad nights. At the end of that time he fell sick. The distemper was a fever, and it inflamed the gout. For the first time in his life, which had been long, he called in a physician. Dr. Sangrado was sent for, the Hippocrates of Valladolid. Dame Jacinta was for sending for the lawyer first, and touched that string, but the patient thought it was time enough, and had a little will of his own upon some points. Away I went, therefore, for Dr. Sangrado, and brought him with me, a tall, withered, wan executioner of the sisters 3, who had done all their justice for at least these 40 years. This learned forerunner of the undertaker had an aspect suited to his office. His words were weighed to a scruple, and his jargon sounded grand in the ears of the uninitiated. His arguments were mathematical demonstrations, and his opinions had the merit of originality. After studying my master's symptoms, he began with medical solemnity. The question here is to remedy an obstructed perspiration. Ordinary practitioners in this case would follow the old routine of salines, diuretics, volatile salts, sulfur, and mercury, but purges and sudorifics are a deadly practice. Chemical preparations are edged tools in the hands of the ignorant. My methods are more simple and more efficacious. What is your usual diet? I live pretty much upon soups, replied the canon, and eat my meat with a good deal of gravy. Soups and gravy, exclaimed the petrified doctor. Upon my word, it is no wonder you are ill. High living is a poisoned bait, a trap set by sensuality to cut short the days of wretched man. We must have done with pampering our appetites. The more insipid, the more wholesome. The human blood is not a gravy. Why, then you must give it such a nourishment as will assimilate with the particles of which it is composed. You drink wine, I warrant you. Yes, said the licentiate, but diluted. Oh, finely diluted, I dare say, rejoined the physician. This is licentiousness with a vengeance, a frightful course of feeding. Why, you ought to have died years ago. How old are you? I am in my 69th year, replied the canon. So I thought, quoth the practitioner. A premature old age is always the consequence of intemperance. If you had only drank clear water all your life, and had been contented with plain food, boiled apples, for instance, you would not have been a martyr to the gout, and your limbs would have performed their functions with lubricity. But I do not despair of setting you on your legs again, provided you give yourself up to my management. The licentiate promised to be upon his good behavior. Sangrado then sent me for a surgeon of his own choosing, and took from him 6 good porringers of blood, by way of a beginning to remedy this obstinate obstruction. He then said to the surgeon, Master Martin Onez, you will take as much more 3 hours hence, and tomorrow you will repeat the operation. It is a mere vulgar error that the blood is of any use in the system. The faster you draw it off, the better. A patient has nothing to do but to keep himself quiet. With him, to live is merely not to die. He has no more occasion for blood than a man in a trance. In both cases, life consists exclusively in pulsation and respiration. When the doctor had ordered these frequent and copious bleedings, he added a drench of warm water at very short intervals, maintaining that water in sufficient quantities was the grand secret in the materia medica. He then took his leave, telling Dame Jacinta and me with an air of confidence that he would answer for the patient's life if his system was fairly pursued. The housekeeper, though protesting secretly against this new practice, bowed to his superior authority. In fact, we set on the kettles in a hurry, and as the physician had desired us above all things to give him enough, we began with pouring down 2 or 3 pints at as many gulps. An hour after we beset him again, then returning to the attack time after time, we fairly poured a deluge into his poor stomach. The surgeon, on the other hand, taking out the blood as we put in the water, we reduced the old canon to death's door in less than 2 days. This venerable ecclesiastic, able to hold it out no longer, as I pledged him in a large glass of his new cordial, said to me in a faint voice, "Hold, Gil Blas, do not give me any more, my friend. It is plain death will come when he will come in spite of water, and though I have hardly a drop of blood in my veins, I am no better for getting rid of the enemy. The ablest physician in the world can do nothing for us when our time is expired. Fetch a notary, I will make my will." At these last words, pleasing enough to my fancy, I affected to appear unhappy, and concealing my impatience to be gone. "Sir," said I, "you are not reduced so low, thank God, but you may yet recover." "No, no," interrupted he, "my good fellow, it is all over. I feel the gout shifting, and the hand of death is upon me. Make haste and go where I told you." I saw sure enough that he changed every moment, and the case was so urgent that I ran as fast as I could, leaving him in Dame Jacintha's care, who was more afraid than myself of his dying without a will. I laid hold of the first notary I could find. "Sir," said I, "the licentiate Sedillo, my master, is drawing near his end. He wants to settle his affairs. There is not a moment to be lost." The notary was a dapper little fellow, who loved his joke, and inquired who was our physician. At the name of Dr. Sangrado, hurrying on his cloak and hat, "For mercy's sake," cried he, "let us set off with all possible speed, for this doctor dispatches business so fast that our fraternity cannot keep pace with him. That fellow spoils half my jobs." With this sarcasm he set forward in good earnest, and as we pushed on to get the start of the grim tyrant, I said to him, "Sir, you are aware that a dying testator's memory is sometimes a little short. Should my master chance to forget me, be so good as to put in a word in my favor." "That I will, my lads," replied the little proctor. "You may rely on it, I will urge something handsome if I have an opportunity." The licentiate, on our arrival, had still all his faculties about him. Dame Jacintha was by his bedside, laying in her tears by wholesale. She had played her game and bespoken a handsome remembrance. We left the notary alone with my master, and went together into the antechamber, where we met the surgeon sent by the physician for another and a last experiment. We laid hold of him. "Stop, Master Martin," said the housekeeper. "You cannot go into Signor Sedillo's room just now. He is giving his last orders, but you may bleed away when the will is made." We were terribly afraid, this pious gentlewoman and I, lest the licentiate should go off with his will half finished, but by good luck the important deed was executed. We saw the proctor come out, who, finding me on the watch, slapped me on the shoulder and said with a simper, "Gil Blas is not forgotten." At these words I felt the most lively joy, and was so well pleased with my master for his kind notice, that I promised myself the pleasure of praying for his soul after death, which event happened anon. For the surgeon having bled him once more, the poor old man, quite exhausted, gave up the ghost under the lancet. Just as he was breathing his last, the physician made his appearance and looked a little foolish, notwithstanding the universality of his deathbed experience. Yet far from imputing the accident to the new practice, he walked off affirming with intrepidity that it was owing to their having been too lenient with the lancet and too chary of their warm water. The medical executioner, the surgeon, seeing that his functions also were at an end, followed Dr. Sangrado. As soon as we saw the breath out of our patron's body, Dame Jacintha, Ines Scylla, and myself joined in a decent chorus of funeral lamentation, loud enough to produce a proper effect in the neighborhood. The emblem of a life to come, though she had more reason than any of us to rejoice, took the soprano part and screamed out her afflictions in a most pathetic manner. The room in an instant was crowded with people, attracted less by compassion than curiosity. The relations of the deceased no sooner got wind of his departure than they pounced down upon the premises and sealed up everything. From the housekeeper's distress, they thought there was no will, but they soon found their mistake, and that there was one without a flaw. When it was opened and they learned the disposition of the testator's principal property in favor of Dame Jacintha and the little girl, they pronounced his funeral oration in terms not a little disparaging to his memory. They gave a broad apostrophe at the same time to the godly legatee and a few blessings to me in my turn. It must be owned I had earned them. The licentiate, heaven reward him for it, to secure my remembrances through life, expressed himself thus in a paragraph of his will. Item: as Gil Blas has already some little smattering of literature, to encourage his studious habits, I give and bequeath to him my library, all my books, and my manuscripts, without any drawback or exception. I could not conceive where this said library might be. I had never seen any. I only knew of some papers with 5 or 6 bound books on 2 little deal shelves in my master's closet, and that was my legacy. The books, too, could be of no great use to me. The title of one was The Complete Man Cook, another a treatise on indigestion with the methods of cure. The rest were the 4 parts of the breviary, half eaten up by the worms. In the article of manuscripts, the most curious consisted of documents relating to a lawsuit in which the prebendary was once engaged for his stall. After having examined my legacy with more minuteness than it deserved, I made over my right and title to these invidious relations. I even renounced my livery and took back my own suit, claiming my wages as my only reward. I then went to look out for another place. As for Dame Jacintha, besides her residue under the will, she had some snug little articles, which, by the help of her good friend, she had appropriated to her own use during the last illness of the licentiate. End of Book 2, Chapter 2. Book 2, Chapter 3 of The Adventures of Gil Blas of Santillane by Alain, René, Lesage, translated by Tobias, Smollett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 3, Gil Blas enters into Dr. Sangrado's service and becomes a famous practitioner. I determined to throw myself in the way of Signor Arias de Londona and to look out for a new berth in his register, but as I was on my way to no thoroughfare, who should come across me but Dr. Sangrado, whom I had not seen since the day of my master's death. I took the liberty of touching my hat. He kenned me in a twinkling, though I had changed my dress, and with as much warmth as his temperament would allow him. "Heyday," said he, "the very lad I wanted to see. You have never been out of my thought. I have occasion for a clever fellow about me, and pitched upon you as the very thing, if you can read and write." "Sir," replied I, "if that is all you require, I am your man." "In that case," rejoined he, "we need look no further. Come home with me, it will be all comfort. I shall behave to you like a brother. You will have no wages, but everything will be found you. You shall eat and drink according to the true faith, and be taught to cure all diseases. In a word, you shall rather be my young Sangrado than my footman." I closed in with the doctor's proposal in the hope of becoming an Aesculapius under so inspired a master. He carried me home on the spur of the occasion to install me in my honorable employment. which honorable employment consisted in writing down the name and residence of the patients who sent for him in his absence. There had indeed been a register for this purpose kept by an old domestic, but she had not the gift of spelling accurately and wrote a most perplexing hand. This account I was to keep. It might truly be called the bill of mortality, for my members all went from bad to worse during the short time they continued in this system. I was a sort of bookkeeper for the other world, to take places in the stage and to see that the first come were the first served. My pen was always in my hand, for Dr. Sangrado had more practice than any physician of his time in Valladolid. He had got into reputation with the public by a certain professional slang, humored by a medical face, and some extraordinary cases, more honored by implicit faith than scrupulous investigation. He was in no want of patience, nor consequently of property. He did not keep the best house in the world. We lived with some little attention to economy. The usual bill of fare consisted of peas, beans, boiled apples, or cheese. He considered this food as best suited to the human stomach, that is to say, as most amenable to the grinders, whence it was to encounter the process of digestion. Nevertheless, easy as was their passage, he was not for stopping the way with too much of them, and to be sure he was in the right. But though he cautioned the maid and me against repletion in respect of solids, it was made up by free permission to drink as much water as we liked. Far from prescribing us any limits there, he would tell us sometimes, "Drink, my children. Health consists in the pliability and moisture of the parts. Drink water by pailsful. It is a universal dissolvent. Water liquefies all the salts. Is the course of the blood a little sluggish? This grand principle sets it forward. Too rapid, its career is checked." Our doctor was so orthodox on this head that he drank nothing himself but water, though advanced in years. He defined old age to be a natural consumption which dries us up and wastes us away. On this principle he deplored the ignorance of those who call wine old men's milk. He maintained that wine wears them out and corrodes them, and pleaded with all the force of eloquence against that liquor, fatal in common both to the young and old, that friend with a serpent in its bosom, that pleasure with a dagger under its girdle. In spite of these fine arguments, at the end of a week a looseness ensued with some twinges, which I was blasphemous enough to saddle on the universal dissolvent and the new-fashioned diet. I stated my symptoms to my master in the hope he would relax the rigor of his regimen and qualify my meals with a little wine, but his hostility to that liquor was inflexible. "If you have not philosophy enough," said he, "for pure water, there are innocent infusions to strengthen the stomach against the nausea of aqueous quaffings. Sage, for example, has a very pretty flavor, and if you wish to heighten it into a debauch, it is only mixing rosemary, wild poppy, and other simples, but no compounds." In vain did he crack off his water and teach me the secret of composing delicious messes. I was so abstemious that, remarking my moderation, he said, "In good sooth, Gil Blas, I marvel not that you are no better than you are. You do not drink enough, my friend. Water taken in small quantities serves only to separate the particles of bile and set them in action, but our practice is to drown them in a copious drench. Fear not, my good lad, lest a superabundance of liquid should either weaken or chill your stomach. Far from thy better judgment be that silly fear of unadulterated drink. I will insure you against all consequences, and if my authority will not serve your turn, read Celsus. That oracle of the ancients makes an admirable panegyric on water. In short, he says in plain terms that those who plead an inconstant stomach in favor of wine publish a libel on their own bowels, and make their organization a pretense for their sensuality. As it would have been ungenteel in me to have run riot on my entrance into the career of practice, I affected thorough conviction. Indeed, I thought there was something in it. I therefore went on drinking water on the authority of Celsus, or to speak in scientific terms, I began to drown the bile in copious drenches of that unadulterated liquor, and though I felt myself more out of order from day to day, prejudice won the cause against experience. It is evident, therefore, that I was in the right road to the practice of physic. Yet I could not always be insensible to the qualms which increased in my frame to that degree as to determine me on quitting Dr. Sangrado. But he invested me with a new office which changed my tone. "Hark you, my child," said he to me one day, "I am not one of those hard and ungrateful masters who leave their household to grow gray in service without a suitable reward. I am well pleased with you. I have a regard for you, and without waiting till you have served your time, I will make your fortune. Without more ado, I will initiate you in the healing art of which I have for so many years been at the head. Other physicians make the science to consist of various unintelligible branches, but I will shorten the road for you and dispense with the drudgery of studying natural philosophy, pharmacy, botany, and anatomy. Remember, my friend, that bleeding and drinking warm water are the two grand principles, the true secret of curing all the distempers incident to humanity. Yes, this marvelous secret which I reveal to you, and which nature beyond the reach of my colleagues has failed in rescuing from my pen, is comprehended in these two articles, namely, bleeding and drenching. Here you have the sum total of my philosophy. You are thoroughly bottomed in medicine, and may raise yourself to the summit of fame on the shoulders of my long experience. You may enter into partnership at once by keeping the books in the morning and going out to visit patients in the afternoon. While I dose the nobility and clergy, you shall labor in your vocation among the lower orders, and when you have felt your ground a little, I will get you admitted into our body. You are a philosopher, Gil Blas, though you have never graduated. The common herd of them, though they have graduated in due form and order, are likely to run out the length of their tether without knowing their right hand from their left. I thank the doctor for having so speedily enabled me to serve as his deputy, and by way of acknowledging his goodness promised to follow his system to the end of my career, with a magnanimous indifference about the aphorisms of Hippocrates. But that engagement was not to be taken to the letter. This tender attachment to water went against the grain, and I had a scheme for drinking wine every day snugly among the patients. I left off wearing my own suit a second time to take up one of my masters and look like an inveterate practitioner, after which I brought my medical theories into play, leaving them to look to the event whom it might concern. I began on an alguazil in a pleurisy. He was condemned to be bled with the utmost rigor of the law, at the same time that the system was to be replenished copiously with water. Next, I made a lodgment in the veins of a gouty pastry cook who roared like a lion by reason of gouty spasms. I stood on no more ceremony with his blood than with that of the alguazil, and laid no restriction on his taste for simple liquids. My prescriptions brought me in 12 reals, an incident so auspicious in my professional career that I only wished for the plagues of Egypt on all the hale subjects of Valladolid. As I was coming out of the pastry cook's, whom should I meet but Fabrizio, a total stranger since the death of the licentiate Sedillo. He looked at me with astonishment for some seconds, then set up a laugh with all his might, and held his sides. He had no reason to be grave, for I had a cloak trailing on the ground, with a doublet and breeches of 4 times my natural dimensions. I was certainly a complete original. I suffered him to make merry as long as he liked, and could scarcely help joining in the ridicule, but I kept a guard on my muscles to preserve a becoming dignity in public, and the better to enact the physician whose part in society is not that of a buffoon. If the absurdity of my appearance excited Fabrizio's merriment, my affected gravity added zest to it, and when he had nearly exhausted his lungs, "By all the powers, Gil Blas," quoth he, "thou art in complete masquerade. Who the devil has dressed you up in this manner?" Fair and softly, my friend, replied I, fair and softly, be a little on your good behavior with a modern Hippocrates. Understand me to be the substitute of Dr. Sangrado, the most eminent physician in Valladolid. I have lived with him these 3 weeks. He has bottomed me thoroughly in medicine, and as he cannot perform the obsequies of all the patients who send for him, I visit a part of them to take the burden off his conscience. He does execution in great families, I among the vulgar. Vastly well, replied Fabrizio, that is to say, he grants you a lease on the blood of the commonalty, but keeps to himself the fee simple of the fashionable world. I wish you joy of your lot. It is a pleasanter line of practice among the populace than among great folk. Long live a snug connection in the suburbs. A man's mistakes are easily buried, and his murders elude all but God's revenge. Yes, my brave boy, your destiny is truly enviable. In the language of Alexander, were I not Fabrizio, I could wish to be Gil Blas. To show the son of Nunez, the barber, that he was not much out in his reckoning on my present happiness, I chinked the fees of the alguazil and the pastry cook, and this was followed by an adjournment to a tavern to drink to their perfect recovery. The wine was very fair, and my impatience for the well-known smack made me think it better than it was. I took some good long draughts, and without gainsaying the Latin oracle, in proportion as I poured it into its natural reservoir, I felt my accommodating entrails to owe me no grudge for the hard service into which I pressed them. As for Fabrizio and myself, we sat some time in the tavern, making merry at the expense of our masters, as servants are too much accustomed to do. At last, seeing the night approach, we parted, after engaging to meet at the same place on the following day after dinner. End of Book 2, Chapter 3.